Hey everyone, tonight we embark on an extraordinary journey through the final chapter of the Skywalker saga, the sequel trilogy that divided fans, sparked debates, and ultimately concluded a story that began in a galaxy far, far away over 4 decades ago. Tonight we explore the rise and fall of the last Jedi, the return of ancient evils, and the awakening of new hope in the darkest of times. So before you settle in for this epic tale, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into beloved universes. Here's something that might surprise you. Nearly 88% of you who watch these videos regularly haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Your subscription truly helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more of these cinematic journeys. And if you're fascinated by the intricate worlds of Game of Thrones, I'd love for you to check out my new channel The Raven's Tales, where I explore the mysteries of Westeros and beyond. The link is waiting for you in the description below. I'm genuinely curious about our global community tonight. Drop a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something magical about knowing we're all sharing this story together, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, wrap yourself in your coziest blanket, and let's drift into tonight's galactic odyssey together. In the depths of space, where stars are born and die in cosmic silence, there exists a moment frozen in time. A young woman stands alone on a desert world, her hand reaching towards something that calls to her across the void. The lightsaber of legends hovers before her, crackling with the memories of heroes and villains, of love and loss, of a galaxy's endless struggle between light and shadow. But as her fingers near the ancient weapon, visions flood her mind. She sees herself standing before a throne of darkness, lightning crackling from her fingertips, while a voice as old as evil itself whispers, "You are my granddaughter, and you will take the throne that is your birthright." The vision shatters. The lightsaber falls, and in that moment, destiny begins to weave its final tapestry. This is the story of how the galaxy's greatest evil returned from death itself. How the last Jedi found the strength to face impossible odds, and how a scavenger from a forgotten world became the key to everything. But most importantly, this is the tale of how hope survived when all seemed lost, and how the light endured even in the deepest darkness. 30 years have passed since the Empire's fall, since Luke Skywalker stood victorious over the Emperor's throne room, since the second Death Star exploded in brilliant fire above the forest moon of Endor. The galaxy celebrated, believing that peace would reign eternal. But peace, as history teaches us, is often nothing more than the quiet before a greater storm. In the unknown regions, beyond the edge of mapped space, something stirred. Imperial remnants, the survivors of the Empire's collapse, gathered under the banner of a new order. They called themselves the First Order, and they brought with them weapons that would make the Death Star seem like a child's toy. At their head stood a figure wrapped in shadow and gold, his face scarred by battles that should have killed him, his voice carrying the weight of ancient darkness. Supreme Leader Snoke, they called him, though few knew the truth of his origins or the master he served. But this is not merely a tale of returning evil. This is the story of how ordinary people found extraordinary courage, a stormtrooper who chose compassion over conditioning, a pilot who learned that true leadership comes not from rank but from sacrifice. A mechanic who discovered that the smallest acts of kindness can ignite the greatest rebellions, and at the center of it all a young woman who grew up believing she was nobody, only to discover that she carried within her the power to save or destroy everything. The Force, that mysterious energy that binds all living things, began to stir with new purpose. Ancient secrets, buried for millennia, started to surface. Sith wayfinders, hidden on forgotten worlds, began to call to those who knew how to listen. and on a desolate planet that existed beyond the edge of known space, in a throne room carved from the bones of dead worlds, an emperor who had ruled the galaxy through manipulation and fear prepared for his final gambit. The stage was set for the last great conflict between light and darkness, between the legacy of the past and the promise of the future. Heroes would rise, legends would fall, and the fate of every living soul in the galaxy would hang in the balance. As we begin this journey together, know that you are about to witness the conclusion of a saga that has captured hearts and minds across generations. From the moment a young farm boy looked up at twin suns and dreamed of adventure, to the final confrontation between the last Jedi and the darkness that refused to die, this is a story of family, legacy, and the eternal struggle between hope and despair. So settle deeper into your blankets, let your breathing slow, and prepare to be transported to a galaxy where the impossible becomes inevitable, where love conquers death, and where even in the darkest hour, there is always a new hope waiting to be born. The stars are calling. The Force is awakening, and our story begins. Now in the endless desert of Jakku, where a scavenger named Rey is about to discover that her destiny is far greater than she ever dared to imagine. To understand the darkness that would consume the galaxy, we must first journey back to the moment of the Empire's apparent defeat. While fireworks lit the skies of Coruscant and Ewoks danced beneath the stars of Endor, not all of the Emperor's servants perished in the flames of the second Death Star. In the shadows of victory, the seeds of a new tyranny were already being sown. In the chaotic months following the Battle of Endor, as the New Republic struggled to establish order across thousands of worlds, the most fanatical Imperial officers refused to accept defeat. They had witnessed the Emperor's power firsthand, had felt the dark side of the Force coursing through the very foundations of their regime. To them, the Empire was not merely a government but a sacred trust, a divine mandate to bring order to a chaotic galaxy. Admiral Rey Sloane, her uniform still bearing the scorch marks of desperate battles, stood on the bridge of her Star Destroyer as it limped toward the unknown regions. Around her, the remnants of the Imperial fleet flickered like dying stars against the black void of space. These were not the gleaming vessels that had once struck fear into the hearts of rebels. These were the survivors, battle-scarred and desperate, carrying within their hulls the dreams of a fallen empire. But they were not alone in their journey to the galaxy's edge. Ancient hyperspace routes, known only to the Emperor's most trusted servants, led them toward worlds that existed beyond the reach of Republic scanners. Here, in the cold depths of uncharted space, they would find something that would transform their desperate flight into a crusade of vengeance. The unknown regions held secrets that predated the Republic, mysteries that the Emperor had spent decades unraveling. On worlds where the very stones whispered with dark power, where ancient Sith temples stood like monuments to forgotten wars, the Imperial survivors discovered that their master's death had been merely the beginning of a far grander design. It was here, in the shadow of a dying red giant star, that they first encountered him. Snoke appeared to them not as a conqueror, but as a savior, his golden robes gleaming against the backdrop of space, his scarred face bearing the wisdom of ages. He spoke to them of the Empire's true purpose, of the cosmic balance that demanded order over chaos, of the destiny that awaited those with the strength to seize it. Under Snoke's guidance, the Imperial remnants began to transform. They discarded the old symbols, the rigid hierarchy that had ultimately led to their downfall. In its place, they forged something new, something that would learn from the Empire's mistakes while maintaining its strength. They called themselves the First Order, and they would not repeat the failures of their predecessors. The construction of Starkiller Base began in the depths of an ice world, its core hollowed out to house a weapon that would make the Death Star seem like a primitive tool. But this was not merely about raw power. Snoke understood that the Empire had fallen because it had ruled through fear alone. The First Order would rule through ideology, through the absolute conviction that their cause was righteous. Recruitment centers were established on worlds devastated by the Empire's fall, where poverty and chaos had left entire populations desperate for stability. Children were taken from their families, not through force but through the promise of purpose, of belonging to something greater than themselves. These young recruits were trained not merely as soldiers but as true believers, their minds shaped by propaganda that convinced them that the Republic was weak, that democracy was chaos, that only through the First Order could the galaxy know true peace. The Stormtrooper program was revolutionized, transformed from the clone-based system of the Empire to something far more insidious. These new soldiers were not genetic copies fighting for a cause they barely understood. They were individuals who had been convinced that their cause was just, that their sacrifice was noble, that their loyalty was a virtue that would bring order to a chaotic galaxy. But perhaps the most tragic element of the First Order's rise was the corruption of Ben Solo, the son of legends, the heir to the Skywalker legacy. In the years following the Empire's defeat, as Luke Skywalker worked to rebuild the Jedi Order, he had taken his nephew as his most promising student. The boy showed incredible potential, his connection to the Force deeper than any Luke had encountered since his father. Young Ben Solo trained on the ancient Jedi world of Ossus, among ruins that spoke of the Order's former glory. Luke watched his nephew with a mixture of pride and growing concern. The boy's power was undeniable. But there was something else, something that reminded Luke uncomfortably of his own father's fall. Ben struggled with anger, with the weight of his family's legacy, with the expectations that came with bearing the Skywalker name. In the quiet moments between training sessions, Luke would find Ben staring at the ancient Jedi texts, his young face troubled by questions that had no easy answers. The boy had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's redemption, of Darth Vader's return to the light, but he had also heard whispers of Anakin Skywalker's fall, of the darkness that had consumed one of the most promising Jedi who had ever lived. The corruption began slowly, so subtly that even Luke's enhanced senses failed to detect it at first. Ben began to have dreams, visions of a galaxy ruled by the strong, of order imposed through power rather than negotiation. In these dreams, a voice would speak to him, ancient and compelling, telling him that the Jedi way was weak, that true peace could only come through strength. Snoke's influence reached across the galaxy like a poison, seeping into Ben's mind through the Force itself. The Supreme Leader had studied the techniques of the ancient Sith, had learned to manipulate the emotions of Force-sensitive individuals from a distance. He whispered to Ben of his true heritage, of the power that flowed through his veins, of the destiny that awaited him if he had the courage to embrace it. The other students at Luke's academy began to notice changes in Ben. He became withdrawn, spending hours in meditation that seemed to darken his mood rather than bring him peace. His lightsaber practice grew more aggressive, his movements sharp and angry where they had once been fluid and controlled. When questioned, he would speak of balance, of the need for the galaxy to accept that peace could only come through strength. Luke sensed the growing darkness in his nephew, but struggled to understand its source. He had defeated the Emperor, had brought his own father back from the dark side. Surely he could guide Ben away from whatever path he was considering. But Luke had never faced an enemy like Snoke, had never encountered corruption that worked not through direct confrontation, but through subtle manipulation of doubt and fear. The Knights of Ren, ancient warriors who served the dark side without claiming the title of Sith, began to appear in Ben's dreams. They spoke to him of power without the constraints of the Jedi Code, of the freedom that came with embracing one's true nature. They showed him visions of a galaxy where the strong ruled and the weak were protected, where order was maintained not through endless debate but through decisive action. As Ben's 18th birthday approached, Luke made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would enter his nephew's mind while the boy slept, would use the Force to understand the source of the darkness that was consuming him. It was a violation of everything the Jedi taught, but Luke convinced himself that it was necessary, that saving Ben was worth the compromise of his principles. On a night when the twin moons of Ossus cast long shadows across the academy, Luke crept into Ben's sleeping chamber. The boy lay peaceful in his sleep, his face still bearing traces of the child Luke remembered. But when Luke touched his mind, when he saw the depth of the corruption that had taken root there, when he witnessed the visions of death and destruction that filled Ben's dreams, fear overwhelmed him. For just a moment, for the briefest instant, Luke's hand moved toward his lightsaber. The green blade ignited, casting an eerie glow across the sleeping boy's face. In that moment, Luke saw not his nephew, but the shadow of Darth Vader, the specter of all the pain and suffering that the dark side could bring. The temptation to end it, to prevent the rise of another Dark Lord, was almost overwhelming. But Ben's eyes opened, and in them, Luke saw not the boy he had trained, but something else entirely. Fear turned to betrayal, betrayal to anger, and anger to a rage that shook the very foundations of the academy. The Force erupted around them, and in that explosion of power, Luke saw his failure made manifest. Ben Solo rose from his bed, his own lightsaber igniting with a crimson glow that spoke of corruption and pain. But he was not alone. The other students, drawn by the disturbance, stood in the doorway, their faces reflecting the horror of what they were witnessing. Some moved to defend their master, others to protect Ben, and in the chaos that followed, the academy that Luke had spent years building was torn apart. When the smoke cleared, when the fires that had consumed the ancient texts finally died, Luke found himself alone among the ruins. Ben was gone, vanished into the night along with several of the other students. The few who remained looked at their master with a mixture of fear and accusation, and Luke knew that his failure was complete. The boy who had been Ben Solo was dead, consumed by the darkness that Luke had failed to prevent. In his place stood something else, something that would soon take the name Kylo Ren and serve as the sword of the First Order. The Knights of Ren, those ancient warriors who had whispered in Ben's dreams, welcomed him as their new master, and together they would become the instruments of Snoke's will. Luke Skywalker, the man who had once brought hope to a galaxy in darkness, looked upon the ruins of his academy and felt something die within him. The Jedi were finished, he told himself. They had failed again, just as they had failed during the Clone Wars, just as they had failed to prevent the rise of the Empire. Perhaps it was time for the galaxy to find its own way, to learn to live without the ancient guardians who had brought as much suffering as they had prevented. With heavy heart and heavier conscience, Luke Skywalker began his journey into exile, carrying with him the weight of failure and the terrible knowledge that in trying to prevent the rise of darkness, he had instead guaranteed its triumph. The map to his location was divided, scattered across the galaxy to ensure that he could never be found unless he chose to return. But the Force works in mysterious ways, and even in failure, even in the darkest hour, the seeds of hope are often planted. For while Luke retreated into isolation, while Ben Solo embraced the identity of Kylo Ren, while the First Order grew in strength and number, somewhere on the desert world of Jakku, a young girl was learning to survive against impossible odds, her connection to the Force growing stronger with each passing day. The stage was set for the sequel trilogy's greatest tragedy and its ultimate redemption. The rise of the First Order was complete, but the awakening of the Force had only just begun. On the desert world of Jakku, where the bones of Imperial Star Destroyers jutted from endless dunes like the ribs of ancient beasts, a young woman named Rey had learned to survive where others would perish. The planet existed on the edge of known space, a graveyard of metal and dreams where the final battle between Empire and Rebellion had been fought decades before. Here, among the twisted wreckage of warships and the scattered remnants of a forgotten conflict, she had spent her entire life waiting for a family that would never return. The twin suns of Jakku rose each morning over a landscape that seemed designed to crush the spirit of any who dared to call it home. Miles of shifting sand stretched in every direction, broken only by the massive hulks of crashed starships that had become landmarks in this desolate wasteland. The superstar destroyer Ravager lay half-buried in the western dunes, its massive hull casting shadows that provided the only relief from the planet's merciless heat. To the east, the broken remains of Mon Calamari cruisers and Imperial frigates created a maze of metal corridors where scavengers like Rey could find the salvage that kept them alive. But Jakku was more than just a graveyard. It was a place where the desperate came to disappear, where those fleeing the chaos of the galaxy's endless conflicts could vanish into the anonymity of survival. Neshima Outpost, a ramshackle collection of tents and makeshift buildings, served as the planet's only significant settlement. Here, under the watchful eye of the junk boss Unkar Plutt, scavengers traded the remnants of galactic war for the portions of food that would keep them alive another day. Reti had arrived on Jakku as a child, left behind by parents whose faces had become blurred memories in her mind. She remembered fragments of their departure, the sound of engines fading into the distance, the promise that they would return for her. But years had passed, and still she waited, clinging to hope with the same determination that allowed her to survive in the desert's harsh embrace. Her home was a testament to both ingenuity and desperation. The fallen AT-AT walker known as Home 1 had become her shelter, its massive leg converted into a surprisingly comfortable dwelling. She had carved handholds into its metal walls, creating a ladder that led to a small opening where she could sleep safely above the desert floor. Inside, the walker was a marvel of improvised engineering. Rey had installed a small moisture vaporator, its gentle hum providing both water and a comforting sound in the endless silence of the desert. Solar panels, salvaged from crashed TIE fighters, powered a simple electrical system that gave her light when the sun set and the temperature dropped to levels that could freeze the unwary. The walls of her home were decorated with items that spoke of dreams beyond the desert. A rebel pilot's helmet hung from a piece of twisted metal, its orange surface faded but still bearing the symbols of hope and freedom. She had found it in the wreckage of an X-wing, its pilot long since claimed by the desert winds. Beside it, a collection of small figurines, carved from scrap metal during the long hours when sandstorms made scavenging impossible, depicted pilots and warriors from stories she had heard in the cantinas of Neshima Outpost. Each morning, Rey would wake before the suns fully rose, the cool desert air still carrying the chill of night. She would prepare her equipment with the methodical care of someone who knew that a single mistake could mean death in the wasteland. Her staff, carved from the metal of a crashed speeder and weighted with salvaged components, served as both tool and weapon. Her goggles, scavenged from an Imperial pilot's helmet, protected her eyes from the sand that could blind and the glare that could drive a person mad. Her wrappings, carefully maintained and repaired with thread pulled from the clothing of the dead, covered every inch of exposed skin. The work of a scavenger was both art and survival. Ren had learned to read the desert, like others read books, to understand which wrecks held the most valuable salvage and which were merely empty shells, picked clean by previous scavengers. She could identify the sound of different types of metal when struck, could tell the difference between Imperial and Rebel technology by touch alone. Her fingers had developed a sensitivity that allowed her to find hidden compartments and secret panels that others missed. But perhaps most remarkably, Rey had developed abilities that she herself did not fully understand. Sometimes, when exploring the deepest parts of a wreck, she would know instinctively which corridors led to valuable salvage and which were dead ends. When machinery refused to work, her touch would sometimes coax it back to life. When the violent sandstorms of Jakku struck without warning, she would sense their approach long before they appeared on the horizon. The desert had taught her to be completely self-reliant. She had learned to repair any machine, to navigate by the stars, to find water in places where none should exist. She could climb vertical metal walls with the grace of a natural athlete, could leap gaps that would terrify experienced soldiers. Her reflexes were impossibly quick, allowing her to avoid the collapse of unstable wreckage and to escape the occasional predator that hunted in the desert's depths. Yet for all her skills, for all her adaptation to this harsh world, Rey remained fundamentally alone. The other scavengers at Niamh Outpost viewed her with a mixture of respect and suspicion. She was too skilled, too lucky, too quick to escape situations that would trap or kill others. They whispered about her when they thought she could not hear, spoke of the way she seemed to know things she should not know, of the way machinery responded to her touch. Unkar Plutt, the Kryloot, who controlled the flow of salvage from his position at the outpost, had made numerous attempts to buy Rey's loyalty exclusively. He offered her better food, safer jobs, even the promise of transportation off-world. But Rey always refused, maintaining her independence even when it meant going hungry. She had learned early that dependence on others was a luxury she could not afford, that survival meant trusting no one but herself. The portions she received for her salvage were barely enough to sustain life, but Rey had learned to make them last. She would soak the dehydrated bread in precious water, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. She had discovered which parts of the desert produced edible plants, which creatures could be caught and cooked, which sources of water were safe to drink. Her knowledge of survival extended beyond mere scavenging to encompass every aspect of desert life. But perhaps the most painful aspect of Rey's existence was the waiting. Each evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and red, she would climb to the highest point of her AT-AT home and scan the horizon for any sign of approaching ships. She kept a small bag packed with her few possessions, ready to leave at a moment's notice should her family finally return. The bag contained little more than a change of clothes and a few personal items, but to Rey it represented the possibility of a life beyond the desert, a future where she was not alone. The years had taught her patience, but they had also taught her the value of hope. In the darkest moments, when the desert seemed determined to claim her life, when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her spirit, Rey would remember the promise that her family would return. She would imagine the sound of engines in the distance, the sight of a familiar ship touching down near her home, the voices of loved ones calling her name. Her days followed a rhythm as constant as the rise and fall of Jakku's twin suns. She would wake before dawn when the desert air still held the coolness of night and begin her preparations for another day of scavenging. The ritual of checking her equipment had become a meditation, each item examined and tested with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation. Her climbing gear, fashioned from salvaged cables and magnetic clamps, was inspected for wear and damage. Her tools, each one carefully crafted from scrap metal and shaped by countless hours of use, were cleaned and sharpened. The journey to the day's scavenging site was often as challenging as the work itself. Rey had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of valuable salvage beneath the sand. The way the wind carved patterns around buried metal, the color changes in the sand that spoke of different types of corrosion, the almost imperceptible variations in temperature that suggested the presence of power sources still functioning after decades of burial. Inside the wrecks, Rey moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to navigate the twisted corridors and collapsed chambers of destroyed starships. She knew which bulkheads were likely to collapse, which electrical systems might still carry dangerous charges, which compartments were most likely to contain the rare components that would earn her enough portions to survive another week. Her movements were fluid and efficient, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions, conserving her strength for the long climb back to the surface. The silence within the wrecks was profound, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through broken hull plating and the occasional creak of metal settling under the weight of accumulated sand. But Rey had learned to find comfort in this silence, to use it as a time for reflection and planning. She would often think about the battles that had been fought in these ships, about the people who had lived and died in these corridors, about the moment when each vessel had fallen from the sky to become part of Jakku's metallic landscape. Sometimes, in the deepest parts of a wreck, Rey would find personal items that spoke of the lives that had been lost, a hollow of a family, its images flickering with the last energy of a dying power cell. A letter written in a language she could not read, its words preserved in the dry desert air. A child's toy, simple and well-worn, that spoke of love and loss in ways that transcended language. These discoveries always affected her deeply, reminding her that the metal she salvaged had once been home to dreams and hopes and fears just like her own. The work was dangerous in ways that went beyond the obvious hazards of unstable structures and dangerous chemicals. The desert itself was a predator, patient and relentless in its attempts to claim new victims. Sandstorms could arise with little warning, transforming the familiar landscape into a howling maze of stinging particles that could strip flesh from bone. The heat could overwhelm even the most experienced scavenger, leading to dehydration and heat stroke that could kill within hours. The cold of the desert nights was equally dangerous, turning the moisture in a person's breath to ice and making exposed skin vulnerable to frostbite. But Rey had learned to work with the desert rather than against it. She understood its rhythms, its moods, its particular brand of harsh beauty. She knew which times of day offered the best working conditions, which seasons brought the most valuable salvage to the surface, which weather patterns indicated the approach of the massive storms that could bury entire wrecks under tons of sand overnight. The other scavengers at Niamh Outpost had their own territories, their own preferred hunting grounds, their own methods of extracting value from the wasteland. But Rey had always worked alone, finding cooperation more trouble than it was worth. She had seen too many partnerships end in betrayal, too many friendships destroyed by the discovery of a particularly valuable find. The desert taught harsh lessons about trust, and Rey had learned them well. Her reputation as a scavenger was built on more than just skill and determination. There was something else. Something that the other scavengers could not quite define, but could not ignore. Rey seemed to know things she should not know, to find things that others missed, to avoid dangers that would trap or kill less fortunate souls. Some attributed this to luck, others to an almost supernatural intuition, but Rey herself was unsure of the source of her abilities. On a day that began like any other, when the suns of Jakku rose over the familiar landscape of wreckage and sand, Rey's life changed forever. She had been working deep in the hull of a crashed Imperial Star Destroyer, her hands following the familiar patterns of salvage work when she heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost lost in the desert wind, but it grew steadily stronger. It was the unmistakable whine of a droid in distress. BB-8 rolled into Rey's life, like a small orange and white miracle, his spherical body moving with surprising grace across the sand. The droid was clearly lost, his internal systems beeping frantically as he tried to navigate the endless dunes. But there was something else about him, something that made Rey's instincts come alive with warning and possibility. This was not just any droid. This was a droid with a purpose, a droid carrying information that someone desperately wanted to find. The Teedo scavenger who had captured BB-8 was a creature of pure greed, his mechanical mount designed for the sole purpose of gathering salvage to trade for food. But Rey had learned to read the body language of desperation, and she could see that BB-8 was not just valuable, but essential to someone. The droid's distress calls were not random electronic noise, but carefully modulated signals designed to attract the attention of a specific person. When Rey freed BB-8 from his captivity, She expected nothing more than the satisfaction of a good deed in a world that offered few opportunities for kindness. But the droid responded to her touch with something approaching joy, his head tilting in a way that suggested intelligence and gratitude. As they made their way back toward Niamh Outpost, BB-8 began to communicate with her in the universal language of necessity and trust. The droid's presence changed everything about Rey's routine. Where she had always worked alone, now she found herself with a companion who anticipated her needs, who could access computer systems she could not reach, who seemed to understand the rhythm of her work. BB-8 was more than just a mechanical assistant. He was a friend, the first real friend Rey had known since arriving on Jakku. But friendship came with complications. BB-8's presence attracted attention from other scavengers, from the mechanical creatures that hunted valuable salvage, from the various criminals and outcasts who made their home in the desert. Rey found herself having to defend not just her own survival, but the safety of a droid who clearly carried secrets that others would kill to possess. The arrival of Finn changed everything once again. The former stormtrooper appeared on the horizon of Rey's life like a figure from the stories she had heard about the galaxy beyond Jakku. His First Order armor was damaged and stained with sand, but Rey could see immediately that he was different from the other refugees who occasionally found their way to the desert world. He moved with military precision, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his posture speaking of training and discipline. But there was something else about Finn, something that resonated with Rey's own sense of being displaced, of not belonging to the world in which she found herself. He was running from something, searching for something, carrying burdens that she recognized even if she could not name them. When he showed concern for BB-8, when he demonstrated knowledge of the larger galactic conflict that most scavengers ignored, Rey realized that her small world was about to expand in ways she could never have imagined. The attack on Niamh Outpost came without warning, as sudden and violent as the sandstorms that could transform the desert landscape in minutes. First Order TIE fighters screamed out of the sky, their distinctive howl sending scavengers running for whatever cover they could find. The laser fire that followed was precise and deadly, aimed not at random destruction but at specific targets. Someone was looking for something, and they were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. Rey's instincts took over with a clarity that surprised even her. She knew without thinking that she and her companions were the targets, that BB-8 carried information that the First Order would do anything to obtain. The knowledge came to her not through rational deduction, but through a deeper understanding, a sense of connection to events far beyond her experience. The escape from Jakku was a masterpiece of desperation and skill. Rey had spent years learning to navigate the bone fields of crashed starships, but she had never imagined that this knowledge would become the key to her survival. The Millennium Falcon, that ancient freighter that had been sitting in the desert for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly became not just a means of escape, but a pathway to destiny. Flying the Falcon was like awakening from a dream she had not known she was having. Rey had never piloted anything larger than a speeder, had never left the surface of Jakku, had never imagined that she possessed the skills necessary to operate one of the most famous ships in galactic history. But as her hands moved over the controls, as she guided the ship through the narrow passages between crashed star destroyers, she felt a sense of rightness that transcended logical explanation. The ship responded to her touch, as if it had been waiting for her specifically, as if the years of sitting dormant in the desert had been a period of preparation rather than abandonment. Systems that should have failed after decades of neglect came online at her command. Navigation computers that should have been corrupted by sand and time provided her with the information she needed to escape Jakku's gravity well. But the most remarkable aspect of the escape was not Rey's piloting skill, but her intuitive understanding of the ship's capabilities. She knew without being told where the manual controls were located, could anticipate the Falcon's responses to her commands, could push the aging vessel to performance levels that its designers had never intended. The ship became an extension of her will, a tool that amplified her natural abilities in ways that defied explanation. As Jakku fell away beneath them, as the stars became visible for the first time in Rey's life, she felt a transformation beginning within her. The desert world that had been her entire existence was now just one small point of light among billions. The galaxy that had existed only in stories and dreams was spread out before her in all its infinite complexity, and somewhere in that vast expanse, answers waited for questions she had not yet learned to ask. The Force, that mysterious energy that connected all living things, began to make itself known to Rey in ways she could not yet understand. She sensed the emotions of her companions, felt the presence of distant conflicts, heard whispers of ancient voices that spoke of destiny and choice. The abilities that had made her such a successful scavenger were revealing themselves to be fragments of something far greater, pieces of a puzzle that connected her to the very fabric of the galaxy. But perhaps most significantly, Rey began to understand that her years of waiting on Jakku had not been wasted time. Every skill she had developed, every hardship she had endured, every moment of loneliness and hope had been preparing her for this moment. The desert had been her teacher, survival had been her training, and now she was ready to discover what lay beyond the horizon of her small world. The girl who had been abandoned on a desert planet was beginning to transform into something the galaxy had not seen for generations. The Force was awakening, and Rey was its chosen instrument. The sequel trilogy's greatest hero was about to discover that her true family was not the parents who had left her behind, but the cosmic force that connected all living things and the destiny that awaited her among the stars. As the Millennium Falcon jumped to hyperspace, carrying Rey away from the only world she had ever known, the first chapter of her true story was just beginning. The Scavenger was about to become something far more important, and the galaxy would never be the same. The galaxy had known peace for 30 years, but peace, as the wisest scholars understood, was often nothing more than the pause between conflicts, hidden in the unknown regions, beyond the reach of New Republic censors and the imagination of those who believed that the Empire's defeat had ended the threat of tyranny forever. The First Order had been preparing for this moment. They had built not just an army but a weapon that would make the Death Star seem like a primitive tool, a device capable of consuming entire star systems to fuel its terrible purpose. In the depths of space, where no Republic patrol had ever ventured, where the very stars seemed to burn with a colder light, the ice world of Elam had been transformed into something that defied comprehension. The planet that had once been sacred to the Jedi, where young Padawans had journeyed to find their Kyber crystals, had been hollowed out and converted into the ultimate expression of the First Order's philosophy. They called it Starkiller Base, and it represented everything the Empire had aspired to but never achieved. The construction had taken decades, requiring the labor of millions of beings who had been convinced that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. The planet's surface had been carved away, revealing the ancient crystal caves that had once sung with the Force. But where the Jedi had found harmony and balance, the First Order had discovered something far more sinister. The Kyber crystals that had once powered lightsabers were now enslaved to a darker purpose, their natural resonance with the Force twisted into a weapon that could reach across the galaxy. General Hux stood on the command deck of the Finalizer, his pale features illuminated by the cold light of tactical displays that showed the weapon's impossible scope. The young officer had risen through the ranks of the First Order, not through battlefield prowess, but through absolute dedication to the cause, through a fanatical belief that the galaxy required the firm hand of order to guide it away from the chaos of democracy. He had watched the construction of Starkiller Base with the satisfaction of an artist viewing his masterpiece, understanding that this weapon would accomplish what the Empire had failed to achieve. The technical specifications of the weapon were staggering. Rather than simply destroying a single planet, Starkiller Base would consume an entire star, channeling the stellar energy through networks of kyber crystals that had been precisely aligned to focus the power into a beam capable of striking targets across the galaxy. The weapon did not require proximity to its victims. It could reach across vast distances, destroying entire star systems with a single shot, while the perpetrators remained safely beyond retaliation. But the true genius of Starkiller Base lay not in its raw power, but in its psychological impact. The Empire had ruled through fear, but that fear had been limited by the Death Star's need to travel to its targets. The destruction of Alderaan had been devastating, but it had also been distant from most of the galaxy's population. Starkiller Base would eliminate that limitation, demonstrating that nowhere in the galaxy was safe from the First Order's reach. The weapon's first target had been chosen with careful consideration. The Hosnian system served as the current seat of the New Republic, the rotating capital that had been established to prevent the centralization of power that had characterized the Old Republic. The system contained not just the government but the Republic's primary fleet, its military academies, and billions of citizens who had grown complacent in their belief that the galaxy's dark days were behind them. Supreme Leader Snoke had approved the target personally, his scarred features betraying no emotion as he contemplated the destruction of an entire star system. The ancient being understood that the weapon's first use would be its most important, that the galaxy's response to this demonstration would determine whether the First Order would face organized resistance or terrified submission. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. The charging sequence began with the precision of a carefully choreographed performance. Massive collectors opened across the planet's surface, their crystalline arrays beginning to absorb the energy of the nearby star. The process was beautiful in its terrible efficiency, the stellar matter streaming toward the weapon in ribbons of superheated plasma that painted the darkness of space with colors that no natural phenomenon could produce. Within the planet's core, the enslaved kyber crystals began to resonate with increasing intensity. The force itself seemed to recoil from the weapon's purpose, but the crystals had been corrupted beyond redemption, their natural harmony transformed into something that served only destruction. The sound they produced was beyond human hearing, but force-sensitive beings across the galaxy would feel its discordant note, like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. The weapon's firing chamber was a cathedral of twisted technology, its walls lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with accumulated stellar energy. First-order technicians monitored the charging process with religious devotion, their faces illuminated by displays that showed power levels climbing toward the threshold of unleashing devastation on a galactic scale. They had trained for this moment for years, understanding that they were about to witness history being made. When the weapon fired, the effect was visible across multiple star systems. The beam of concentrated stellar energy tore through hyperspace itself, following trajectories that defied conventional understanding of physics. The kyber crystals had been arranged to create a focusing effect that could split the beam into multiple streams, each one capable of destroying a planet. The Hosnian system became the first victim of this impossible weapon, its 5 inhabited worlds disappearing in brilliant flashes of light that could be seen from neighboring systems. The destruction was complete and instantaneous. Billions of lives were extinguished in moments, their final thoughts lost in the cosmic scream of dying worlds. The New Republic fleet, the symbol of galactic peace and democracy, was vaporized along with the planets it had sworn to protect. The Senate chambers where representatives had debated the galaxy's future became nothing more than scattered atoms drifting in the void where a star system had once thrived. But the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Across the galaxy, beings who had felt secure in their homes and communities suddenly understood that nowhere was safe from the First Order's reach. The weapon had demonstrated that distance was no protection, that the traditional strategies of warfare had been rendered obsolete by technology that could strike anywhere in the galaxy without warning. On the forest world of Takodana, Where Maz Kanata had maintained her ancient castle for over 1,000 years, the ripples of the weapon's use were felt not just through conventional senses, but through the Force itself. The diminutive being who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who had seen the Jedi at their height and watched them fall to Order 66, understood immediately that the galaxy had entered a new phase of darkness. Resi felt the disturbance as a physical pain, a sensation of loss so profound that it brought tears to her eyes without her understanding why. The Force carried the screams of the dying across impossible distances, and her newly awakened sensitivity made her a conduit for suffering she could not comprehend. She had left Jakku seeking answers about her past, but instead she was being confronted with a future that seemed to promise only more pain and loss. The castle on Takadana had become a refuge for those who existed on the margins of galactic society. Smugglers, rebels, information brokers, and beings who had simply grown weary of the galaxy's endless conflicts gathered here under Maz's protection. The ancient structure had weathered countless storms, both meteorological and political, its walls bearing the scars of battles fought across the centuries. But the news of the Hosnian system's destruction transformed the castle from a place of refuge into a staging ground for resistance. The patrons who had come seeking nothing more than a quiet drink and a safe place to conduct their business suddenly found themselves faced with the reality that the galaxy's brief peace had ended. The First Order had announced their presence with an act of destruction so complete that it left no room for negotiation or compromise. Among the assembled beings, word spread quickly that the droid BB-8 carried information crucial to the resistance against the First Order. The map fragment he bore was said to reveal the location of Luke Skywalker, the legendary Jedi who had disappeared years before. Some spoke of him as a myth, others as a coward who had abandoned the galaxy when it needed him most. But all understood that if the stories were true, if Luke Skywalker could be found, he might represent the galaxy's only hope against the First Order's devastating weapon. The attack on Maz's castle came without warning, a demonstration of the First Order's reach and their determination to recover the map fragment at any cost. TIE fighters screamed out of the sky, their distinctive howl announcing the arrival of destruction. The ancient stone walls that had withstood the test of centuries crumbled under the assault of modern weapons, and the beings who had gathered in search of peace found themselves in the midst of a battle that would determine the galaxy's future. Rhett's confrontation with Kylo Ren in the forest surrounding the castle was a moment that would define both their destinies. The former Ben Solo had been tracking the map fragment with the obsession of someone who understood that finding Luke Skywalker was crucial to the First Order's ultimate victory. But when he encountered Rey, when he attempted to probe her mind for the information he sought, something unexpected happened. The Force flowed between them with an intensity that surprised both participants. Rey, who had never received formal training in the ways of the Force, instinctively resisted Kylo's mental intrusion. More than that, she turned the probe back on him, seeing into his mind with a clarity that revealed the conflict raging within the fallen Jedi. She saw his fear, his doubt, his desperate need for approval from the master who had corrupted him. The revelation that she possessed such power terrified Rey almost as much as it intrigued Kylo Ren. He had been trained by Luke Skywalker, had studied the ancient Jedi texts, had learned to harness the Force through years of discipline and meditation. But this scavenger from a desert world was demonstrating abilities that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. The implications were staggering, and both of them understood that their confrontation had revealed something that would change the course of the galactic conflict. Meanwhile, the Resistance had been mobilizing for a desperate assault on Starkiller base. The destruction of the Hosnian system had eliminated the New Republic's fleet, leaving only the small force that Leia Organa had been building to face the First Order. The odds were impossible, but the alternative was to allow the weapon to be used again, to watch as star system after star system was consumed, to fuel the First Order's conquest of the galaxy. The technical challenges of attacking Starkiller base were unprecedented. The weapon was protected by shields that made the Death Star's defenses seem primitive by comparison. The planet's surface was covered with defensive installations, and the First Order fleet that guarded it was larger than anything the Resistance could hope to match in direct combat. But the weapon had a weakness, a flaw that was born of its very design. The process of consuming a star left the weapon temporarily vulnerable. As the stellar matter was channeled into the planet's core, the massive energies involved created instabilities that could be exploited by a sufficiently precise strike. The window of opportunity was measured in minutes, and the margin for error was non-existent, but it was the only chance the galaxy had. Han Solo's decision to infiltrate the base and lower its shields was driven by more than tactical necessity. The legendary smuggler had spent years blaming himself for his son's fall to the dark side, had carried the weight of failure like a wound that would never heal. The mission to Starkiller base offered him a chance at redemption, an opportunity to face the boy who had once been Ben Solo and perhaps bring him back from the darkness. The confrontation between father and son on the weapon's central platform was a moment of truth that had been building for years. Han approached his son with the desperate hope of a parent who refused to accept that his child was lost forever. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, of the possibility of coming home. For a moment it seemed as though Ben Solo might emerge from the shadow of Kylo Ren, that the love between father and son might prove stronger than the corruption of the dark side. But the moment passed, and with it, the galaxy's hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The red lightsaber that pierced Han Solo's heart was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the complete transformation of Ben Solo into something darker, a declaration that the boy who had once dreamed of being a Jedi was gone forever, replaced by a creature of the dark side who would stop at nothing to fulfill his master's will. The death of Han Solo reverberated through the Force like a shockwave, felt by every Force-sensitive being in the galaxy. Leia, fighting to coordinate the desperate assault on the weapon, felt her husband's death as a physical blow that nearly brought her to her knees. Rhea, trapped in the weapon's corridors, experienced the loss as a profound disturbance in the Force that awakened abilities she had never known she possessed. The final battle for Starkiller Base was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. In space, the small Resistance fleet engaged the First Order's defenders in a desperate attempt to buy time for the ground assault. On the planet's surface, Finn and Rey searched for a way to complete the mission that Han Solo had died attempting. And in the snowy forest surrounding the weapon's core, the Force itself seemed to be choosing sides as Rey faced Kylo Ren in lightsaber combat. The lightsaber that called to Rey in Maz's castle had once belonged to Luke Skywalker, and before him to Anakin Skywalker. It had been present at some of the most pivotal moments in galactic history, had been the instrument of both salvation and destruction. Now it ignited in Rey's hands with a blue glow that seemed to push back the darkness of the forest, its familiar hum carrying the weight of destiny. The duel between Rey and Kylo Ren was more than just a battle between light and dark. It was a confrontation between two possible futures for the galaxy, two different interpretations of what the Force demanded of those who could wield it. Kylo fought with the rage and desperation of someone who had sacrificed everything for power, only to discover that power could not fill the emptiness in his soul. Rey fought with the determination of someone who had learned that survival required facing impossible odds with nothing but hope and will. When the unstable red lightsaber met the steady blue blade, the collision sent shockwaves through the Force that could be felt across the galaxy. The dark side energy that Kylo had embraced warred with the light that Rey was only beginning to understand. In that moment, the sequel trilogy's central conflict was laid bare, the eternal struggle between those who would use power to dominate and those who would use it to protect. The destruction of Starkiller Base marked the end of the First Order's hope for a quick victory over the galaxy. The weapon that had been designed to terrify the Republic into submission had instead awakened a resistance that would prove more dangerous than any army. The planet's core, destabilized by the loss of its stellar fuel source, began to collapse in on itself, creating a miniature star that would burn for millennia as a monument to the galaxy's refusal to surrender to tyranny. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The galaxy had lost billions of lives, had seen the destruction of entire worlds, had witnessed the murder of one of its greatest heroes. The First Order had been wounded but not destroyed, and their response to this defeat would be swift and merciless. The sequel trilogy's second act was about to begin, and with it, the revelation that the galaxy's struggle against darkness was far from over. As the survivors of Starkiller Base escaped into hyperspace, carrying with them the wounded and the hope of a galaxy that refused to surrender, the stage was set for the next chapter in the eternal conflict between light and darkness. The Force had awakened, but its ultimate purpose remained shrouded in mystery, waiting to be revealed in the trials that lay ahead. The coordinates hidden within BB-8's memory banks led to a world that existed beyond the edge of known space, where the very ocean seemed to pulse with the rhythm of ancient secrets. Ash-2 was a planet of primordial beauty, its surface covered entirely by endless seas that reflected the light of a distant sun. From these waters rose islands of black stone, their surfaces carved by millennia of wind and wave into shapes that seemed almost deliberately crafted by some cosmic artist. This was the first Jedi temple, the birthplace of the order that had once brought peace to the galaxy, and now it served as the final refuge of the last Jedi. Luke Skywalker stood at the edge of the highest cliff on the island, his weathered face turned toward the horizon, where sky met water in an unbroken line. The years of exile had changed him, carving lines of sorrow and regret into features that had once been young and hopeful. His hair had turned white, his shoulders bore the weight of failure, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and lost too much to ever find peace again. The lightsaber that had once been his constant companion now rested in a stone hut, forgotten and unused, a relic of a time when he had believed that the Force could be trusted to guide him toward the light. The island itself seemed to respond to Luke's presence, as if the very stones remembered the footsteps of the Jedi who had walked these paths in ages past. The ancient temple that crowned the highest peak was a structure of impossible age, its stones fitted together with a precision that spoke of builders who had understood secrets that the galaxy had long since forgotten. Carved into the walls were symbols that predated the Republic, hieroglyphs that told the story of the Force's first servants and their struggle to understand the cosmic power that flowed through all living things. Resi's arrival shattered the carefully constructed solitude that Luke had maintained for years. The young woman who climbed the ancient steps to reach him carried with her not just the lightsaber he had lost on Cloud City, but the weight of a galaxy's desperate hope. Her presence was like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that disturbed the carefully maintained balance of his self-imposed exile. He had come to Arc-2 to die in peace, to let the Jedi Order fade into legend as he believed it deserved. But the Force, it seemed, had other plans. The confrontation between the legendary Jedi Master and the untrained Scavenger was a study in contrasts. The Rey approached with the eager determination of someone who had grown up on stories of Luke Skywalker's heroism, who believed that the return of the last Jedi would somehow solve all the galaxy's problems. But the man she found was not the hero of legend. He was broken, bitter, convinced that the Jedi had brought more harm than good to the galaxy. When she extended his father's lightsaber toward him, he took it with trembling hands, looked at it for a long moment, then carelessly tossed it over his shoulder as if it were nothing more than scrap metal. The rejection was more than just a refusal to take up arms again. It was a denial of everything Rey had hoped to find, a shattering of the dreams that had sustained her through the dangers of her journey. She had expected to find a wise teacher, a powerful ally, a beacon of hope in the galaxy's darkest hour. Instead, she found a man who had retreated so far into despair that he could not see past his own failures to recognize the potential that stood before him. But Jakku was not a place where such conflicts could remain unresolved. The island's ancient stones had witnessed the rise and fall of countless Jedi, had absorbed the wisdom and pain of generations of Force users who had sought understanding in its meditation chambers. The very air seemed to whisper with the voices of the past, and gradually, inevitably, Luke found himself drawn back into the role he had tried so hard to abandon. The training began reluctantly, with Luke more interested in demonstrating why Rey should abandon her quest than in actually teaching her anything useful. He showed her the ancient Jedi texts, their pages filled with wisdom that had been accumulated over thousands of years, but he spoke of them with bitter irony, pointing out how little that wisdom had actually accomplished. The Jedi had failed to prevent the rise of the Empire, had been destroyed by one of their own, had brought suffering to the galaxy through their arrogance and blindness. Rey's response to this cynicism was to demonstrate abilities that Luke had never seen in any of his former students. She lifted massive stones with casual ease, her connection to the Force flowing as naturally as breathing. During her meditation exercises, she reached out with senses that spanned the galaxy, touching the minds of beings she had never met, feeling their pain and joy as if they were her own. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to be in communication with someone else, someone whose presence in the Force felt dark and conflicted. The connection between Rey and Kylo Ren was unlike anything in the Jedi archives. Through some mechanism that neither of them understood, they could see each other across the vast distances of space, could speak as if they were in the same room, could even touch objects in each other's presence. Luke recognized the phenomenon as a Force bond, but one of unprecedented strength and complexity. The implications were staggering and deeply troubling. Luke's investigation into the nature of Rey's abilities led him to the darkest chapter of his own history. He had sensed the growing darkness in his nephew Ben Solo, had felt the corruption that was slowly consuming the young man's soul. In a moment of weakness, a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Luke had considered ending the threat before it could fully manifest. He had ignited his lightsaber in Ben's sleeping chamber, had stood over the boy with the weapon raised, had been on the verge of striking down his own nephew to prevent the rise of another Dark Lord. The moment had passed, but Ben had awakened to see his uncle standing over him with a weapon, had felt the murderous intent that Luke had been unable to completely suppress. The betrayal had been complete, the final push that drove Ben Solo into the arms of the dark side. Luke had created the very monster he had sought to prevent, had driven his nephew to destroy the new Jedi Order and embrace the identity of Kylo Ren. The weight of this failure had driven Luke to Jakku, to the first Jedi temple, where he could contemplate the mistakes that had led to such catastrophe. He had studied the ancient texts, had meditated on the nature of the Force, had gradually come to the conclusion that the Jedi were a failed experiment that had brought more harm than good to the galaxy. The Force would be better served by allowing the old ways to die, by letting a new generation find their own path to understanding. But Rey's presence challenged every assumption Luke had made about the future of the Force. Her abilities were raw but incredibly powerful. Her instincts sharp despite her lack of formal training. She embodied everything the Jedi had once aspired to be, possessing great power but remaining humble, facing darkness but choosing light, carrying the weight of others' expectations but never losing sight of her own moral compass. The ancient Jedi texts that Luke had guarded for years became the focus of Rey's education. These were not mere instruction manuals, but repositories of wisdom that contained the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of Jedi experience. Each page was illuminated with symbols and diagrams that explained not just techniques but philosophies, not just powers but responsibilities. Rey absorbed this knowledge with an hunger that reminded Luke of his own youth, when the discovery of each new ability had filled him with wonder and excitement. The meditation chambers carved into the island's rock face became Ray's classrooms, their walls bearing the marks of countless lightsaber training sessions conducted by Jedi long dead. Here, surrounded by the physical remnants of the Order's history, she learned to center herself, to find calm in the midst of chaos, to touch the Force without being consumed by it. The exercises were challenging, requiring her to maintain focus while Luke subjected her to increasingly difficult tests of concentration and will. The porgs that inhabited the island became unexpected teachers, their simple joy in existence serving as a reminder that the Force flowed through all living things, not just those who could manipulate it consciously. Ray's found herself drawn to these creatures, their playful nature providing a counterpoint to the serious intensity of her training. Luke watched her interact with them and saw glimpses of the compassion that had once driven him to become a Jedi, the simple desire to protect and nurture life in all its forms. The ocean surrounding Ahch-To was a constant presence, its tides marking the passage of time and providing a rhythm for meditation that connected Rey to the planet's natural cycles. She would sit on the cliff's edge for hours, feeling the spray of the waves against her face, listening to the endless conversation between wind and water. In these moments, she felt most connected to the Force, most aware of the vast web of energy that connected all things. But the peace of Ahch-To was constantly disrupted by the visions that came to Rey through her connection with Kylo Ren. She saw the galaxy beyond the island, felt the suffering of beings caught in the First Order's expanding campaign of conquest. The Resistance was being hunted, driven from system to system by an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Leia Organa, the legendary princess who had become a general, was fighting a desperate battle against impossible odds, her small fleet constantly on the run from forces that vastly outnumbered them. The connection with Kylo Ren was both a source of information and a constant temptation. Through their bond, Rey could see the conflict that raged within the former Ben Solo, could feel his pain and loneliness, even as she witnessed his acts of violence and destruction. She began to believe that he could be saved, that the light she sensed buried deep within him could be rekindled. Luke warned her against such thoughts, reminded her of how his own attempt to save his nephew had led to catastrophe, but Rey's compassion would not be easily discouraged. The ancient tree that housed the original Jedi texts became a focal point for the philosophical debates between master and student. Luke argued that the Jedi had become too rigid, too bound by tradition to adapt to changing circumstances. Their failure to prevent the rise of the Empire, their destruction at the hands of Order 66, their inability to detect the corruption growing within their own ranks, all pointed to fundamental flaws in their approach to the Force. Rey countered that the Jedi's failures did not invalidate their ideals, that the principles of compassion, justice, and self-sacrifice were still worth pursuing even if previous generations had fallen short of perfect implementation. She saw in the ancient texts not rigid dogma but flexible wisdom, guidelines that could be adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their essential truth. The Force, she argued, was not the problem. It was the Jedi's understanding of the Force that had been incomplete. The island's wildlife provided numerous opportunities for Rey to practice her growing abilities. The creatures that lived in the rock pools below the temple were sensitive to Force disturbances, their behavior changing in response to the emotions of the Force users who shared their environment. Rey learned to calm her mind by observing their reactions, to measure her progress by the peace she could bring to the living things around her. The crystal caves beneath the temple held their own mysteries, their walls lined with formations that seemed to sing in harmony with the Force. Rey discovered that these crystals were similar to those used in lightsaber construction, but far older and more complex in their internal structure. They had been growing for millions of years, their crystalline matrices shaped by the Force itself into patterns that reflected the cosmic order underlying all existence. Luke's reluctance to train Rey gradually gave way to genuine investment in her progress. Despite his philosophical objections to the continuation of the Jedi Order, he could not deny the young woman's potential or her sincere desire to help others. He began to see in her not just another student, but a possible redemption for his own failures, a chance to create something new from the ruins of the old. The lightsaber training that Luke had initially refused to provide became an essential part of Rey's education. Using ancient practice droids that had been maintained by the island's caretakers, she learned the basic forms that had been passed down through generations of Jedi. Her natural athleticism and quick reflexes, honed by years of survival on Jakku, gave her an advantage in learning the physical aspects of lightsaber combat. But the mental discipline required to truly master the weapon proved more challenging. The remote location of Arch 2 provided the perfect environment for Rey to explore the full extent of her abilities without the distractions and dangers of the inhabited galaxy. She learned to extend her senses across vast distances to feel the presence of other Force users even when they were star systems away. The connection with Kylo Ren became a two-way channel of communication, allowing her to learn about the larger conflict while gradually building a relationship with the man she hoped to save. But the island's isolation also meant that Rey was largely unaware of the desperate situation facing the Resistance. While she trained in peace and safety, Leia's forces were being systematically hunted down by the First Order. The new superweapon that had destroyed the Hosnian system was being prepared for another strike, and the galaxy's hope for freedom was rapidly fading. The pressure to complete her training and return to the fight was enormous, but Luke continued to insist that she was not ready to face the darkness that awaited her. The turning point came when Rey ventured into the island's dark side cave, a natural formation that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Here, surrounded by mirrors that reflected not her physical appearance, but her deepest fears and desires, she confronted the question that had haunted her since childhood. The visions she experienced in the cave showed her glimpses of her parents, but the answers she sought remained frustratingly elusive. The experience in the cave convinced Rey that she had learned all she could from Luke's reluctant teaching. The galaxy needed her, the Resistance was in danger, and she believed that her connection with Kylo Ren represented the key to ending the conflict without further bloodshed. Against Luke's desperate warnings, she made the decision to leave Arch 2 and confront the darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy. Luke's reaction to Rey's departure was one of profound despair. He had failed again, had watched another student walk away from his teaching toward what he was certain would be their destruction. The weight of his failures seemed to press down on him like a physical burden, and he made the decision to burn the ancient Jedi texts to end the Order once and for all rather than watch it continue to produce tragedy. But the Force, it seemed, had other plans. As Luke stood before the ancient tree with a torch in his hand, the spirit of Yoda appeared to him, the old Jedi Master, looking exactly as he had in life, but somehow more vibrant, more alive than Luke had ever seen him. The conversation between master and student was both gentle and profound, a reminder that failure was the greatest teacher, that the end of one thing often marked the beginning of another. Yoda's intervention saved more than just the ancient texts. It reminded Luke that the Force was larger than any individual, that the failures of the past did not negate the possibility of future success. The old Jedi Master spoke of Rey with affection and hope, suggesting that she possessed qualities that Luke had never recognized in himself. The student had become greater than the teacher, as was the way of the Force. The revelation that Rey had already taken the ancient texts with her when she left the island provided Luke with his first genuine smile in years. The young woman had proven herself worthy of the Jedi legacy not through perfect adherence to tradition, but through her willingness to forge her own path, while honoring the wisdom of those who had come before. She represented everything the Jedi could become if they were willing to learn from their mistakes and adapt to new circumstances. As Luke stood alone on the cliff where he had first encountered Rey, he felt the stirring of something he had not experienced in years. Hope. The galaxy's future was no longer in his hands, but in the hands of someone who might be able to succeed where he had failed. The last Jedi was about to discover that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from clinging to the past, but from having the courage to let go and trust in the future. The Force was awakening to new possibilities, and the sequel trilogy's greatest lesson was about to be revealed. Sometimes the burden of being the last becomes the gift of being the first, and the end of one story marks the beginning of another. Rey's journey was far from over, but she had learned enough to face whatever darkness awaited her among the stars. The ancient temple of Jakku held secrets that went deeper than the carved stones and weathered walls that Rey had come to know during her training. Beneath the meditation chambers and practice grounds lay caverns that existed in a realm between light and shadow, where the Force itself seemed to pool in dark, stagnant currents that whispered of forbidden knowledge and dangerous truths. It was here, in the island's hidden depths, that Rey would face the greatest test of her emerging abilities and confront the darkness that existed not just in the galaxy around her, but within her own heart. The call came to her during the deepest hours of the night, when the twin moons of Jakku cast silver light across the restless ocean, and the ancient stones seemed to hum with accumulated power. Rey had been meditating in her simple quarters, trying to make sense of the visions that had been plaguing her dreams, when she felt it. A pull, subtle but insistent, drawing her toward the island's heart. It was not the warm, nurturing presence of the light side that she had learned to recognize during her training with Luke. This was something else, something that promised answers to questions she had been afraid to ask. The journey to the cave required Rey to navigate passages that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. The walls were covered with symbols that predated even the ancient Jedi texts, hieroglyphs that told the story of the Force's earliest servants and their struggle to understand the cosmic power that flowed through all living things. But these symbols were different from those in the temple above. They spoke of balance, of the necessity of understanding both light and dark, of the dangers that came from denying the shadow that existed within every living being. As Rey descended deeper into the island's core, the very air seemed to thicken with possibility and menace. The Force flowed here in ways that defied her understanding, creating currents and eddies that reflected her own emotions back to her with disturbing clarity. She could feel her fears taking shape in the shadows, her doubts crystallizing into almost physical presences that followed her through the twisting passages. The cave's main chamber was a natural cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness, while its walls were lined with mirrors that reflected not light, but something far more revealing. As Rey approached the center of the space, she found herself surrounded by reflections that showed not her physical appearance, but her deepest desires and most carefully hidden fears. The mirrors seemed to respond to her presence, their surfaces rippling like water as they displayed visions of past and future, of possibilities that might have been, and futures that might yet come to pass. The first vision showed her parents, but not as the loving family she had imagined during her lonely years on Jakku. Instead, she saw them as they truly were, desperate and afraid, selling their daughter to a junk dealer in exchange for passage off a dying world. The revelation was like a physical blow, shattering the carefully constructed fantasy that had sustained her through years of waiting and hoping. But even as the truth wounded her, she felt a strange sense of relief. The uncertainty was over. The questions that had haunted her childhood finally had answers, even if those answers were not what she had hoped to hear. But the mirror was not finished with her. As Rey watched in fascination and horror, the reflections began to show her other possibilities, other paths her life might have taken. She saw herself as a child, taken from Jakku by parents who had the courage to stay, raised in safety and comfort on a world where water was abundant and food was never scarce. She saw herself as a student at one of the galaxy's great universities, her natural intelligence channeled into the study of history and archaeology rather than the desperate scramble for survival. More disturbing were the visions of power, of Rey embracing the dark side and using her abilities to dominate rather than protect. She saw herself on a throne of black stone, her eyes blazing with Sith fire as she commanded armies of darkness. She saw worlds kneeling before her, their populations enslaved by her will, their freedoms sacrificed to her vision of perfect order. The images were seductive in their clarity, offering a future where she would never again be powerless, never again be abandoned or alone. The mirrors showed her Kylo Ren, but not as the conflicted enemy she had come to know through their Force connection. Instead, she saw Ben Solo, the young man he had been before his fall, standing beside her in the visions of darkness. Together they ruled the galaxy with absolute authority, their combined power making them unstoppable. The vision was intoxicating, offering not just power but companionship, an end to the loneliness that had defined her existence. But as Rey watched these seductive images, she began to understand the true nature of the test the cave was presenting. The visions were not prophecies but temptations, reflections of her own desires and fears made manifest by the Force. The cave was showing her what she could become if she chose to embrace the darkness, but it was also showing her the price of such choices. The power came with isolation, the companionship with corruption, the certainty with the loss of everything that made her who she was. The realization brought with it a moment of perfect clarity. Rey understood that the dark side was not some external enemy to be defeated, but a part of herself that had to be acknowledged and integrated. The anger she felt at her parents' abandonment, the rage that filled her when she witnessed injustice, the desire for power that whispered in her quietest moments, all of these were parts of her nature that could not be simply denied or suppressed. The Force connection with Kylo Ren had been growing stronger during her time on Arctar, their conversations becoming more frequent and more intimate. Through their bond, she had seen glimpses of his inner turmoil, had felt the pain that drove him to embrace the dark side. But she had also sensed something else, a spark of light that refused to be extinguished despite all his efforts to bury it. The connection between them was unlike anything described in the ancient texts, a phenomenon that neither Luke nor the Jedi archives could explain. During one of their conversations, as Rey sat in the ruins of the ancient temple while Kylo stood in the command chamber of his Star Destroyer, she found herself reaching out to touch what she thought was a reflection. But her hand met solid flesh, and she realized that their connection had evolved beyond mere communication. They could touch each other across the vast distances of space, could share physical sensations as well as thoughts and emotions. The implications were staggering and deeply troubling. Luke's discovery of these conversations filled him with terror and rage. He had seen the power of the dark side to corrupt even the strongest Jedi, had watched his own nephew fall to temptation despite years of careful training. The idea that Rey was communicating with Kylo Ren, that she was allowing herself to be influenced by someone who had embraced the darkness, was almost more than he could bear. His attempts to warn her about the danger she was courting only seemed to drive her further away from his teaching. The philosophical debates between master and student became more intense as Rey's training progressed. Luke argued that the Jedi had learned through bitter experience that the dark side was not to be embraced or integrated, but conquered and rejected. The ancient texts spoke of balance, but they also spoke of the necessity of choosing the light over the darkness, of accepting that some temptations were too dangerous to be entertained even in the name of understanding. Reti countered that the Jedi's absolute rejection of the dark side had led to their downfall, that their inability to understand and acknowledge the shadow within themselves had made them vulnerable to manipulation and corruption. She pointed to the ancient symbols in the cave, to the teachings of the first Jedi that spoke of balance and integration rather than denial and suppression. The Force, she argued, was not meant to be divided into light and dark, but understood as a unified whole. The training sessions became more challenging as Rey's abilities grew. Luke pushed her to her limits, forcing her to confront situations that tested not just her power, but her moral compass. He created scenarios where the easy path led to darkness, where doing the right thing required sacrifice and suffering. But Rey consistently chose the difficult path, demonstrated again and again that her instincts led her toward protection rather than domination, toward service rather than power. The island's caretakers, the ancient beings who had maintained the temple for millennia, watched Rey's progress with interest and concern. They had seen countless Jedi come and go, had witnessed the rise and fall of the Order, had observed the patterns that led to triumph and tragedy. In Rey they saw something new, a potential that had not existed in the galaxy for generations. But they also saw the danger, the possibility that her power could be turned to destructive ends if she made the wrong choices. The connection with Kylo Ren provided Rey with insights into the larger galactic conflict that Luke's isolation had denied her. Through their bond, she learned of the First Order's continued expansion, of the Resistance's desperate flight from system to system, of the weapon that was being prepared to deliver another devastating blow to the forces of freedom. The knowledge filled her with urgency, with the need to act before more innocent lives were lost to the galaxy's endless cycle of war. But the connection also provided her with something else: hope. In her conversations with Kylo Ren, she saw glimpses of the man he had been before his fall, moments when the mask of darkness slipped to reveal the pain and confusion beneath. She began to believe that he could be saved, that the light she sensed within him could be rekindled if she could just reach him in the right way. The possibility that the galaxy's suffering could be ended not through victory but through redemption became an obsession that colored all her other considerations. Luke's warnings about the danger of trying to save Kylo Ren became more desperate as he watched Rey's growing fascination with her enemy. He had felt the same hope about his nephew, had believed that love and patience could overcome the corruption of the dark side. But his efforts had only driven Ben Solo deeper into darkness, had ultimately led to the destruction of the new Jedi Order and the rise of the Knights of Ren. The idea that Rey might repeat his mistakes, might allow her compassion to blind her to the reality of what Kylo Ren had become, filled him with dread. The ancient texts that Rey studied in her spare time spoke of force bonds that transcended the normal boundaries between individuals. These connections, rare and powerful, could link two beings across any distance, allowing them to share thoughts, emotions, and even physical sensations. But the texts also warned of the dangers such bonds presented, of the ways they could be used to manipulate and corrupt, of the difficulty of maintaining one's individual identity when so closely connected to another consciousness. The meditation chambers where Rey practiced her exercises became the focal point for her exploration of the Force connection. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of Jedi, she learned to strengthen and control the bond while maintaining her own sense of self. The process was challenging, requiring her to open herself to Kylo Ren's influence while maintaining the barriers that protected her own mind and spirit. The Porgs and other creatures that inhabited the island seemed to sense the changes in Rey as her training progressed. They would gather around her during her meditation sessions, their simple presence providing a grounding influence that helped her maintain connection to the natural world. Their unconditional acceptance reminded her that power was not the goal but the means, that the Force was meant to serve life rather than dominate it. The turning point came when Rey ventured deeper into the dark side cave than she had ever gone before, following passages that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Here, in the island's deepest heart, she found a chamber that contained not mirrors, but something far more disturbing, a vision of the future that showed her the consequences of her choices. She saw herself standing before the Emperor's throne, her hand extended in friendship toward Kylo Ren. But the vision showed her that her compassion had been manipulated, that her desire to save him had been used to deliver both of them into the hands of a greater darkness. The Emperor, alive and more powerful than ever, welcomed them both as his new apprentices, his scarred face twisted in a smile of triumph as he contemplated the destruction of the last hope for galactic freedom. The vision was so vivid, so terrifying in its implications, that Rey fled the chamber in panic. But the images followed her, haunting her dreams and coloring her waking thoughts. She began to understand that her connection with Kylo Ren was not just a natural phenomenon, but something that had been deliberately created and manipulated. The revelation that their bond might be artificial, that it might be serving someone else's purposes, shook her faith in everything she had come to believe about her destiny. Luke's reaction to Rey's account of her vision was one of grim satisfaction. He had been trying to warn her about the dangers of the dark side, about the ways it could corrupt even the best intentions. The vision confirmed his worst fears about the Force connection, about the possibility that Rey was being manipulated by forces beyond her understanding. But his attempts to use the vision to dissuade her from her course only seemed to strengthen her resolve. Rey's decision to leave Ahch-To was not made in haste or anger, but in calm determination. She had learned what she could from Luke's teaching, had explored the depths of her own nature, had confronted the darkness within herself, and chosen to embrace the light. The galaxy needed her, the Resistance was in danger, and she believed that her connection with Kylo Ren, dangerous as it might be, represented the key to ending the conflict without further bloodshed. The departure was marked by a confrontation between master and student that laid bare the fundamental differences in their understanding of the Force. Luke argued that she was not ready, that her compassion would be used against her, that her attempts to save Kylo Ren would lead to her own destruction and the triumph of darkness. Rey countered that the Jedi's failure to act, their retreat from the galaxy's problems, had allowed evil to flourish unchecked. Sometimes, she argued, the only way to preserve the light was to risk being consumed by darkness. As Rey's ship lifted off from Ahch-To's surface, carrying her toward whatever fate awaited her among the stars, Luke stood on the cliff where he had first encountered her. The island seemed emptier without her presence, the ancient stones somehow less alive, but mixed with his fear for her safety was a strange sense of pride. She had proven herself worthy of the Jedi legacy, not through perfect adherence to tradition, but through her willingness to forge her own path, while honoring the wisdom of those who had come before. The Force connection that had brought Rey and Kylo Ren together was about to face its ultimate test. The temptation of the dark side had been resisted, but the greater challenges lay ahead. The sequel trilogy's most dangerous moment was approaching, and with it, the revelation that sometimes the greatest enemy is not the darkness without, but the darkness within. The galaxy had never seemed so small or so fragile as it did in the hours following the destruction of the Hosnian system. What had once been a vast expanse of countless worlds and infinite possibilities had been reduced to a battlefield where the forces of tyranny hunted the last defenders of freedom through the cold darkness of space. The Resistance, that small band of fighters who had dared to stand against the First Order's growing power, found themselves alone and outnumbered, their every move tracked by an enemy that seemed to anticipate their strategies before they could even be implemented. The evacuation of Jakku had been a masterpiece of desperate efficiency, but efficiency could not disguise the terrible reality of their situation. General Leia Organa stood on the bridge of the Resistance cruiser Raddus, her weathered face illuminated by the tactical displays that showed the grim mathematics of their predicament. Behind them, the First Order fleet stretched across the stars like a swarm of metallic predators, their weapons charged and ready to deliver the killing blow to the galaxy's last hope for freedom. The command ship itself was a monument to the Resistance's philosophy of making do with whatever resources they could gather. The Raddus had been built as a medical frigate, its original purpose reflected in the care and precision of its construction, but years of retrofitting had transformed it into a warship, its hull bristling with weapons that had been salvaged from a dozen different conflicts. The ship's corridors echoed with the sounds of beings from across the galaxy, refugees and fighters who had chosen to stand against the darkness rather than submit to its embrace. Leia moved through these corridors with the measured pace of someone who had learned to project calm, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The legendary princess had become a general not through military ambition, but through necessity, her natural leadership abilities sharpened by decades of fighting against forces that sought to crush the light of freedom. She carried within her the weight of every decision, every sacrifice, every life that had been lost in the struggle against tyranny. The hyperspace tracking that allowed the First Order to follow the Resistance fleet represented a technological breakthrough that changed the fundamental nature of warfare. For generations, hyperspace had been the ultimate refuge, the one place where pursued ships could find safety from their enemies. But the First Order's new capability meant that there was no escape, no place to hide, no respite from the relentless pursuit. The Resistance was trapped in a chase that could only end in their complete destruction. Poe Dameron understood the implications better than most. The young pilot had been born into a galaxy where the Resistance represented hope and possibility, where the fight against the First Order was seen as a just cause that would ultimately triumph. But the reality of their situation was undeniable. They were being hunted by forces that vastly outnumbered them, pursued by enemies whose resources seemed inexhaustible. The traditional strategies of rebel warfare, the hit-and-run tactics that had served them so well in the past, were useless against an enemy that could follow them anywhere. The sacrifice of the bomber fleet had bought them time, but time was a luxury they could not afford to waste. Each hour that passed brought them closer to the moment when their fuel would run out, when their ships would be reduced to helpless targets drifting in space. The First Order's commanders understood this perfectly, were content to maintain their pursuit at a distance that kept the Resistance ships just out of range of their weapons, while ensuring that escape remained impossible. Admiral Holdo's arrival to take command of the fleet was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The veteran officer brought with her a reputation for unconventional thinking and decisive action, qualities that had served her well in previous conflicts. But she also brought a strategic perspective that differed significantly from the more aggressive approach favored by younger officers like Poe Dameron. The tension between these different philosophies would soon become a source of conflict within the Resistance itself. The plan that Holdo implemented was based on a careful analysis of their tactical situation and the recognition that conventional warfare could not save them. Rather than attempting to fight their way out of the trap, she chose to use the Resistance most valuable asset, their willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. The strategy required precise timing, absolute secrecy, and the kind of courage that had always defined the Resistance at its best. Meanwhile, on the casino world of Canto Bight, a different kind of battle was being fought. The planet's luxury resorts and gambling establishments represented everything the Resistance opposed, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, while the majority of the galaxy's inhabitants struggled to survive. The elegant spires and gleaming towers of the city rose from artificial islands that floated on seas of liquid crystal, their surfaces reflecting the light of distant stars in patterns that spoke of beauty purchased with the suffering of others. Finn and Rose Tico's mission to the casino world was born of desperation and hope in equal measure. The young mechanic had volunteered for the dangerous assignment, not because she sought glory or adventure, but because she understood better than most what the Resistance's defeat would mean for the galaxy's oppressed populations. Her sister's sacrifice during the bombing run had left her with a burning desire to ensure that such sacrifices were not made in vain. The contrast between the casino's opulence and the poverty that existed beyond its walls was stark and deliberate. The wealthy patrons who gambled fortunes on the turn of a card or the outcome of a race seemed utterly disconnected from the suffering their wealth had created. They moved through the casino's halls in elaborate costumes that cost more than most beings would earn in a lifetime, their laughter and conversation creating a soundtrack of oblivious privilege that made Finn's stomach turn. The fathier races that provided entertainment for the casino's patrons were a perfect metaphor for the galaxy's condition under the First Order's growing influence. The magnificent creatures, their natural grace and beauty, perverted by the demands of sport and spectacle, were forced to run courses that pushed them to their limits, while their suffering provided amusement for those who bet on their performance. The parallel to the galaxy's own situation was impossible to ignore. Roz's background as a mechanic had given her insights into the casino's operations that proved invaluable to their mission. She understood the complex systems that kept the artificial islands afloat, the networks of power and communication that connected the various establishments, the carefully maintained illusions that allowed the patrons to ignore the reality of their situation. Her technical expertise combined with Finn's experience as a former stormtrooper made them an effective team despite their different backgrounds. The revelation of the casino's true nature came not through investigation, but through observation. As Finn and Rose moved through the establishment's halls, they began to notice details that spoke of connections to the galactic conflict that raged beyond the casino's walls. The weapons dealers who mingled with legitimate business people, the First Order officers who enjoyed the casino's hospitality while off duty, the transactions that took place in shadowy corners, where credits changed hands for purposes that were never openly discussed. The children who served as slaves in the casino's lower levels represented the most disturbing aspect of Canto Bight's operation. These young beings, taken from their families and forced to work in conditions that would have been condemned on any Republic world, were the hidden foundation upon which the casino's luxury was built. Their suffering was carefully concealed from the patrons, but it was no less real for being invisible. The codebreaker they encountered in the casino's detention cells was a figure who embodied the moral ambiguity that characterized the galaxy's conflict. DJ, as he called himself, possessed the technical skills they needed, but lacked any commitment to their cause. His philosophy was simple. In a galaxy where both sides were willing to commit atrocities, survival required maintaining neutrality and selling one's services to the highest bidder. The moral certainty that drove the resistance was, in his view, a luxury that practical people could not afford. The infiltration of the First Order's flagship represented the culmination of everything Finn had learned about himself since his defection from the Stormtrooper program. The ship's corridors were familiar territory, but they were also a reminder of everything he had rejected when he chose to fight for the Resistance. The stormtroopers who patrolled the vessel had once been his comrades, beings who had shared his conditioning and his circumstances. Now they were obstacles to be overcome, enemies whose defeat was necessary for the mission's success. The betrayal that followed was perhaps inevitable, given DJ's stated philosophy and the First Order's superior resources. But the pain of watching their mission fail, of seeing their friends captured and their cause betrayed, was almost unbearable for both Finn and Rose. The Codebreaker's justification for his actions, his claim that both sides were equally guilty of perpetuating the galaxy's suffering, rang hollow in the face of the First Order's obvious commitment to tyranny and oppression. The revelation that the casino's patrons were selling weapons to both sides of the conflict added another layer of complexity to the galaxy's situation. The war that was tearing the galaxy apart was also a source of profit for those wealthy enough to exploit it. The suffering of billions was transformed into credits that flowed into the accounts of beings who viewed the conflict as nothing more than a business opportunity. The escape from the casino, achieved through the liberation of the Fathiers and the chaos that followed, provided a moment of triumph in what had otherwise been a failed mission. The sight of the magnificent creatures running free across the casino's artificial landscape, their joy in their freedom infectious despite the circumstances, reminded Finn and Rose of why they were fighting. The Resistance was not just about defeating the First Order, it was about creating a galaxy where all beings could experience the freedom that was their birthright. The stable boy who helped them escape, a child whose force sensitivity manifested in his ability to call a broom to his hand, represented the hope that sustained the Resistance through its darkest hours. The galaxy was full of potential heroes, beings who possessed the power to change their circumstances if they could just find the courage to act. The Resistance's example, their willingness to stand against impossible odds, served as an inspiration to others who might otherwise have accepted their fate. Rose's sacrifice to save Finn from his own suicide mission was a moment that perfectly captured the philosophy that distinguished the Resistance from its enemies. While the First Order sought to defeat their opponents through superior firepower and ruthless tactics, the Resistance understood that victory could only be achieved by protecting what they loved. The act of self-sacrifice, the willingness to risk everything for another person's safety, was what made the Resistance more than just another military force. The aftermath of the failed mission left both Finn and Rose with a deeper understanding of the galaxy's complexity and their own place in the larger conflict. They had seen the worst of what the galaxy had to offer, had witnessed the callous indifference of those who profited from others' suffering. But they had also seen the potential for good that existed in even the most unlikely places, the spark of rebellion that could ignite in the hearts of those who had been written off as powerless. The crystal foxes of Crate, those elegant creatures whose bodies seemed to be formed from the planet's mineral substrate, became symbols of the beauty that could emerge from the harshest environments. Their presence in the ancient rebel base was a reminder that life found a way to flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances, that hope could survive even when everything seemed lost. The base itself was a testament to the cyclical nature of the galaxy's conflicts. The caverns and tunnels that had once sheltered rebels during the Empire's reign were now providing sanctuary for their spiritual descendants. The old equipment still functioned. The defensive systems still responded to familiar commands. The hidden passages still offered escape routes for those who knew how to find them. Luke's final confrontation with Kylo Ren was witnessed by the galaxy through 100 different news feeds and communication channels. The image of the legendary Jedi Master facing down the entire First Order army with nothing but his lightsaber and his connection to the Force became an instant symbol of resistance that spread across the galaxy faster than any official propaganda could counter it. The revelation that Luke's appearance had been a Force projection, that he had died in the effort to save the Resistance, added another layer of meaning to his sacrifice. The last Jedi had given everything to ensure that the spark of rebellion would survive, that hope would endure even after his passing. His death was not an ending but a beginning, a challenge to a new generation to take up the mantle of resistance. The children of Canto Bight, scattered across the galaxy in the aftermath of the casino's exposure, carried with them the memory of the Resistance's courage and the knowledge that even the most powerful systems could be challenged. The stable boy who had helped Finn and Rose escape looked up at the stars and saw not distant lights but possibilities, destinations where freedom might be found or created. The spark of rebellion that had been ignited by the Resistance's sacrifice would spread across the galaxy, inspiring others to stand against tyranny and oppression. The sequel trilogy's greatest victory was not military but moral, not the defeat of an enemy, but the awakening of hope in the hearts of those who had forgotten that change was possible. As the survivors of the Resistance gathered in the Millennium Falcon's hold, their numbers reduced but their determination unshaken, they carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved something more valuable than military victory. They had reminded the galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for, that sacrifice had meaning, and that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire that would burn away the darkness. The final act of the sequel trilogy was about to begin, and with it, the revelation that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the courage to keep fighting when all seems lost. The spark of rebellion had been lit, and no force in the galaxy could extinguish it. In the depths of the unknown regions, where space itself seemed to bend and twist under the influence of cosmic forces that defied comprehension, there existed a world that should not have been. Exegol was a planet that existed outside the normal flow of time and space, a realm where the dark side of the Force had pooled and concentrated over millennia until it had achieved a kind of malevolent consciousness. Here, in temples carved from the bones of ancient Sith lords and powered by the suffering of countless souls, the most terrible secret in galactic history was about to be revealed. The Emperor had never died. Palpatine's apparent destruction aboard the second Death Star had been nothing more than an elaborate deception, a carefully orchestrated transition from one form of existence to another. The Sith Lord, who had manipulated galactic politics for decades, who had orchestrated the Clone Wars and the rise of the Empire, who had nearly succeeded in destroying the Jedi Order forever, had prepared for this moment long before his confrontation with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Death was merely another obstacle to be overcome, another limitation to be transcended through the power of the dark side. The process of cheating death had required sacrifices that would have horrified even the most dedicated Sith practitioners of previous eras. Palpatine had studied the ancient texts of Darth Plagueis, had learned the secrets of manipulating midi-chlorians to preserve consciousness beyond the death of the body. But the technique required more than just knowledge. It demanded a constant supply of life force to sustain the artificial existence he had created for himself. The cloning facilities hidden beneath Exegol's surface were marvels of perverted science, their chambers filled with bodies that bore the Emperor's face but lacked his essence. Each clone was a potential vessel, a new form that could house his consciousness should his current body fail. But the cloning process was imperfect, the bodies weak and prone to decay. The Emperor's survival depended not just on the technology that sustained him, but on the will of the dark side itself. The Sith Eternal, the cult that had served Palpatine's vision for generations, had been preparing for this moment since the Empire's apparent fall. These were not mere worshippers, but true believers who understood that the Emperor's vision of galactic order was worth any sacrifice. They had spent decades gathering resources, building ships, training soldiers, all in service of the moment when their master would return to claim his rightful place as ruler of the galaxy. The Final Order fleet that lay hidden in Exegol's shipyards was a sight that would have impressed even the Empire at its height. Thousands of star destroyers, each one equipped with a planet-killing weapon, hung in the planet's artificial atmosphere like a swarm of metallic locusts waiting to devour the galaxy. The ships were crewed by beings who had never known freedom, who had been raised from birth to serve the Emperor's will without question or hesitation. But the Emperor's plans extended far beyond mere military conquest. He had learned from the Empire's failures, had understood that ruling through fear alone was insufficient to maintain lasting control. The new order he envisioned would be built on something more fundamental than terror. It would be constructed on the willing submission of beings who had been convinced that freedom was a burden they could not bear. The broadcast that announced the Emperor's return was transmitted across the galaxy on every frequency, through every communication network, to every world that possessed the technology to receive it. The message was simple but devastating. The Emperor lived, the Final Order was real, and the galaxy had a limited time to surrender before facing complete annihilation. The voice that delivered this ultimatum was unmistakably that of Palpatine, carrying with it the weight of authority and the promise of terrible retribution. The revelation of the Emperor's survival sent shockwaves through the galaxy that went far beyond the immediate military implications. For 30 years, the galaxy had believed that the evil of the Empire had been defeated, that the sacrifices made by the Rebel Alliance had purchased lasting peace. The knowledge that it had all been an illusion, that the architect of the galaxy's suffering had been manipulating events from the shadows, was almost too much for many beings to comprehend. Refu's discovery of her true parentage was intricately connected to the Emperor's survival. The young woman who had grown up believing herself to be nobody, who had spent years waiting for parents who would never return, learned that she was the granddaughter of the galaxy's greatest monster. Her father had been one of the Emperor's failed clones, a being who had somehow developed a conscience and chosen to flee rather than serve as his creator's vessel. The revelation was delivered with the casual cruelty that characterized all of Palpatine's interactions with his enemies. Standing in the throne room of the Sith Citadel, surrounded by the accumulated darkness of millennia, the Emperor explained to Rey how her bloodline made her the perfect heir to his legacy. The power that flowed through her veins was not just the random gift of the Force, but the concentrated essence of the dark side itself, shaped by generations of careful breeding and manipulation. The Emperor's physical appearance reflected the cost of his extended existence. His body was a horror of decay and artificial preservation, kept alive through technology and dark side energy in equal measure. His face was a mask of scarred tissue and mechanical implants, his eyes burning with the accumulated hatred of decades spent in the realm between life and death. Yet despite his physical deterioration, his presence in the Force was more powerful than ever, a black hole of malevolent energy that seemed to draw all light into its depths. The Sith throne room where these revelations took place was a monument to the dark side's capacity for corruption and evil. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs that told the story of the Sith's rise and fall, their victories and defeats, their eternal struggle against the light. The ceiling was lost in shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, while the floor was inlaid with patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric forms that seemed to violate the basic principles of reality. The Emperor's explanation of his survival was delivered with the satisfaction of a master craftsman explaining his greatest work. He had spent years preparing for the possibility of his physical death, had established contingencies and backup plans that ensured his consciousness would survive even if his body was destroyed. The moment of his apparent death aboard the Death Star had been the trigger for a carefully orchestrated resurrection, a transformation that had taken him beyond the limitations of mortal existence. But the Emperor's return was not just about personal survival. It was about the completion of a plan that had been generations in the making. The rise and fall of the Empire, the corruption of Anakin Skywalker, the manipulation of the Clone Wars, all of it had been designed to create the conditions necessary for the Sith's ultimate victory. The galaxy had been weakened by decades of conflict, its institutions corrupted, its people desperate for any form of stability. The revelation that Snoke had been nothing more than a puppet, an artificial being created to serve as the Emperor's proxy, cast the entire sequel trilogy in a new light. The Supreme Leader who had seemed so powerful, so mysterious, was revealed to be just another tool in Palpatine's vast arsenal of deception. The First Order itself had been nothing more than a distraction, a way to keep the galaxy's attention focused on an obvious threat while the real danger gathered strength in the shadows. Resi's struggle with the revelation of her heritage was complicated by the Emperor's offer of power and position. He did not simply threaten her or demand her submission. Instead, he appealed to the part of her that had always felt alone and powerless. The dark side, he explained, was not about evil but about embracing reality, about accepting that the strong were meant to rule and the weak were meant to serve. Her compassion, her desire to help others, these were not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be channeled in service of a greater purpose. The Emperor's throne room was filled with the spirits of ancient Sith Lords, their consciousness preserved within the dark side energy that permeated the Citadel. These were the voices that had whispered to Kylo Ren during his training, the influences that had shaped his understanding of the Force's true nature. They spoke to Ren now, their words carrying the weight of millennia of accumulated wisdom and corruption. The test that the Emperor presented to Rey was deceptively simple. Kill him, and she would inherit his power along with his throne. The act would complete her transformation to the dark side, would make her the vessel through which his consciousness could continue to exist. But the alternative was to watch helplessly as the Final Order destroyed every world that had ever sheltered those she loved, to see the galaxy enslaved by forces she was powerless to stop. The Emperor's physical deterioration was more than just the result of his unnatural existence. It was a reflection of the dark side's ultimate nature. The power that he had sought to master had instead mastered him, transforming him into something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. His body was a prison as much as a vessel, a form that constrained his consciousness while providing the anchor that kept him connected to the physical universe. The revelation that the Emperor had been manipulating events throughout the sequel trilogy cast every previous moment in a new light. Ben Solo's fall to the dark side, the rise of the First Order, the destruction of Luke's Jedi Academy, all of it had been orchestrated by the hidden hand of the Sith. The young man who had thought he was choosing his own path had been following a script written by his grandfather's greatest enemy. The Emperor's explanation of the Force dyad between Rey and Kylo Ren was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. The connection between them was not a natural phenomenon, but an artificial creation, a bond that had been forged through decades of careful manipulation and dark side energy. The Emperor had been using their connection to drain their life force to sustain his own existence while weakening the two beings who posed the greatest threat to his plans. The army of Sith troopers that guarded the Emperor's citadel represented the ultimate expression of his vision for galactic order. These were not conscripted soldiers or converted believers, but beings who had been created specifically to serve the dark side's will. They felt no doubt, no fear, no compassion that might interfere with their duty. They were the perfect servants of a perfect tyranny, the final evolution of the stormtrooper program that had served the Empire so well. The Emperor's offer to Rey was accompanied by a demonstration of the power that could be hers if she chose to embrace her heritage. The dark side energy that flowed through the citadel responded to her presence, creating manifestations of pure force lightning that danced around her hands. The sensation was intoxicating, a feeling of absolute power and control that made her understand for the first time why so many had been seduced by the dark side's promises. But the Emperor's greatest weapon was not his power or his armies, but his understanding of the human heart. He knew that Rey's greatest strength was also her greatest weakness, her compassion for others, her unwillingness to allow innocents to suffer for her choices. The lives of billions hung in the balance, and the Emperor made it clear that their survival depended entirely on her decision. The revelation that the Emperor had been behind every tragedy in the sequel trilogy was delivered with the casual cruelty that had always characterized his interactions with his enemies. Han Solo's death, Luke's exile, the destruction of the Hosnian system, all of it had been part of a grand design that had been decades in the making. The pain that Rey had felt, the losses she had endured, the struggles she had faced, all of it had been orchestrated by the being who now stood before her, claiming to be her grandfather. The Emperor's throne room was not just a seat of power, but a nexus of dark side energy that connected to every corner of the galaxy. From this chamber, he could reach out with his consciousness to influence events on distant worlds, to whisper in the ears of those who might serve his purposes, to plant the seeds of corruption that would bloom into full betrayal when the time was right. The Final Order fleet that waited in Exegol's atmosphere was more than just a military force. It was a symbol of the Emperor's ultimate vision for the galaxy. Each ship was a world killer, capable of destroying entire civilizations with a single shot. The fleet represented the end of the old order, the beginning of a new age where resistance would be not just futile but impossible. The Emperor's explanation of his survival was punctuated by displays of power that demonstrated the futility of conventional resistance. The dark side energy that flowed through him was beyond anything that Rey had encountered, a force that seemed to draw its strength from the suffering of every being in the galaxy. The lightning that danced around his fingers was not just electricity but pure hatred made manifest, the accumulated rage of millennia given physical form. The revelation that Rey's parents had died to protect her from the Emperor's plans added another layer of tragedy to her story. The couple who had abandoned her on Jakku had not been running from responsibility, but from the most powerful being in the galaxy. Their sacrifice had given her the chance to grow up free from the Emperor's influence, to develop her own moral compass independent of his manipulation. The Emperor's offer was simple but devastating. Join him willingly, and the galaxy would be spared the worst of his wrath. Resist and watch as every world that had ever shown kindness to the Resistance was reduced to ash. The choice was designed to appeal to her compassion while simultaneously corrupting it, to transform her greatest strength into the instrument of her own downfall. The dark side energy that permeated the Citadel was so concentrated that it seemed to have a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on Rey's consciousness and whispered of the power that could be hers if she only had the courage to embrace it. The temptation was not subtle but overwhelming, a psychic assault that targeted every doubt and fear she had ever harbored about her own worthiness. The Emperor's final gambit was to force Rey to choose between her own moral purity and the lives of those she loved. The dark side, he explained, was not about evil but about accepting reality, about making the hard choices that others were too weak to make. The galaxy needed strong leadership, and she was the only one with the power to provide it. As the Emperor's explanation reached its climax, as the full scope of his plans became clear, Rey understood that she was facing not just a choice between good and evil, but between two different visions of what the galaxy could become. The Emperor offered order purchased with tyranny, peace bought with submission, stability built on the graves of those who dared to resist. The alternative was to continue fighting, to risk everything for the possibility of something better. The revelation that the Emperor had returned from death itself was more than just a plot twist. It was a challenge to everything the galaxy had believed about the nature of good and evil, about the possibility of redemption, about the ultimate fate of those who chose to serve the dark side. The sequel trilogy's greatest villain had returned, and with him, the specter of an evil that could never be permanently defeated. The stage was set for the final confrontation between light and darkness, between the power of the individual and the authority of the state, between hope and despair. The Emperor's return had changed everything, and the galaxy would never be the same. The galaxy stood at the precipice of its darkest hour, balanced on the edge of a knife that could cut either toward freedom or eternal servitude. The Emperor's broadcast had achieved exactly what Palpatine had intended, sending waves of terror through every populated system, while simultaneously revealing the true scope of the threat that had been growing in the shadows. But terror, as the galaxy had learned during the Empire's reign, could be a double-edged weapon. While some cowered in fear, others found in that fear the spark that ignited their courage. On the hidden world of Ajayne Kloss, where the Resistance had established their newest base among the ancient trees and forgotten ruins, the remnants of the galaxy's freedom fighters gathered to plan what might be their final stand. The base itself was a testament to the resourcefulness that had always characterized the Resistance, its buildings constructed from salvaged materials and powered by generators that had been repaired so many times that their original specifications were merely suggestions. Refi's return from her confrontation with the Emperor had changed everything. The young woman who had left as a student uncertain of her place in the galaxy had returned as a leader who understood the true nature of the threat they faced. Her revelations about her heritage, about the Emperor's survival, about the Final Order fleet that waited in the unknown regions, had shattered any remaining illusions about the scope of the challenge that lay ahead. The knowledge that Rey carried the blood of the galaxy's greatest monster was a burden that she bore with the same quiet determination that had characterized her entire journey. The revelation that her power came not from some noble lineage, but from the darkest corners of the Sith legacy, was a test of her character that went to the very core of her identity. But rather than allowing the revelation to corrupt her, she had chosen to use it as a source of strength, understanding that the origin of power mattered far less than how that power was used. The ancient Jedi texts that Rey had studied on Arc 2 had prepared her for this moment, though she had not understood their true significance at the time. The writing spoke of a time when the galaxy would face its greatest trial, when the accumulated darkness of millennia would gather for a final assault on the light. The texts described techniques that had been forbidden for generations, methods of channeling the Force that required sacrifice and courage in equal measure. Leia's condition had been deteriorating since the confrontation with Kylo Ren aboard the Supremacy, but the revelation of the Emperor's return had given her new purpose. The legendary princess who had become a general understood that her time was limited, that the energy she had expended to survive in the vacuum of space had taken a toll that could not be repaid. But she also understood that her death could have meaning if it served the cause of freedom. The training that Leia provided to Rey in those final days was unlike anything the young woman had experienced before. This was not the philosophical instruction that Luke had offered on Arc 2, nor the technical guidance that the ancient texts had provided. This was the practical wisdom of someone who had spent her entire life fighting against impossible odds, who had learned to find hope in the darkest moments and strength in the most desperate circumstances. The lightsaber that Leia had hidden away for decades was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the path not taken, the life she might have lived if the galaxy had not demanded that she choose politics over the ways of the Force. The weapon's construction reflected Leia's personality, elegant and practical in equal measure, designed not for elaborate combat, but for the simple purpose of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The revelation that Luke had been training Leia in the ways of the Force, even as he struggled with his own doubts about the Jedi's future, provided another layer of understanding to the sequel trilogy's complex narrative. The twins who had been separated at birth had found their way back to each other, not just as siblings, but as partners in the galaxy's struggle against darkness. Their connection through the Force had allowed them to share knowledge and strength, even across the vast distances that separated them. The message that went out from Ajan Kloss was not a traditional military communication, but a plea to the conscience of every being in the galaxy. The broadcast carried with it the weight of history, the accumulated wisdom of generations of freedom fighters who had understood that liberty was not a gift to be received, but a responsibility to be earned. The message was simple but profound. The galaxy's freedom was not something that could be defended by others, but something that required the active participation of every being who valued their independence. The response to the call was unlike anything the galaxy had seen since the Clone Wars. From the core worlds to the Outer Rim, from the wealthy systems that had grown fat on peace to the frontier worlds that had never known true security, ships began to gather. These were not military vessels, but the tools of ordinary life transformed into instruments of resistance. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, mining ships, agricultural transports, all of them converging on the coordinates that would take them to the final battle. The fleet that assembled was a monument to the galaxy's diversity and its capacity for heroism. Ships from 1,000 different worlds, crewed by beings who spoke hundreds of languages and followed countless different traditions, all united by the understanding that some things were worth dying for. The sight of this improvised armada, this collection of vessels that had never been designed for war but had been volunteered for the most important battle in galactic history, was enough to bring tears to the eyes of even the most hardened veterans. Lando Calrissian's role in organizing this response was crucial to its success. The former smuggler and administrator had spent decades building relationships across the galaxy, earning the trust of beings who had learned to be suspicious of authority and promises. His message carried weight not because of his official position, but because of his personal reputation, his known history of standing up to tyranny when it would have been easier to submit. The gathering of the fleet was complicated by the practical challenges of coordinating so many different types of vessels. The ships that responded to the call were not equipped with standardized communication systems or compatible navigation computers. Many of their crews had never served in military operations, had no experience with the kind of coordination that would be required for the assault on Exegol. But they had something more valuable than training. They had the desperation of beings who understood that this might be their last chance to preserve their freedom. The plan that emerged from the Resistance's strategic sessions was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The Final Order fleet was too large and too well defended to be defeated through conventional tactics. But the Emperor's weapon had a weakness that could be exploited, a vulnerability that arose from the very nature of the dark side itself. The Sith had always been their own worst enemy, their hunger for power inevitably leading to the conflicts that destroyed them. The revelation that the Emperor's power was tied to the Sith Eternal's rituals provided the key to understanding how he might be defeated. The dark side energy that sustained him was not limitless but dependent on the continuous sacrifice of others, on the willing submission of beings who had chosen to serve his vision. If that flow of energy could be interrupted, if the connection between the Emperor and his source of power could be severed, he would become vulnerable to the kind of direct confrontation that had once been impossible. Resi's preparation for the final battle was both physical and spiritual, requiring her to master techniques that had been forbidden to Jedi for generations. The ability to channel the power of all the Jedi who had come before, to become a conduit for the accumulated light of millennia, was not something that could be learned from books or practiced in training sessions. It was a gift that could only be earned through sacrifice, through the willingness to risk everything for the sake of others. The connection between Rey and Kylo Ren had evolved beyond the simple force bond that had characterized their earlier interactions. The shared experiences, the mutual understanding that had developed despite their differences, had created something new in the galaxy. Their relationship represented the possibility of redemption, the chance that even the deepest corruption could be overcome through love and forgiveness. The lightsaber that Rey constructed for the final battle was a reflection of her journey from Scavenger to Jedi. The weapon's design incorporated elements from every stage of her development, from the staff that had protected her on Jakku to the techniques she had learned from the ancient texts. But most importantly, it incorporated her own understanding of what it meant to be a Jedi, her personal interpretation of the balance between power and responsibility. The yellow blade that ignited from Rey's lightsaber was a color that had not been seen in the galaxy for centuries, a hue that represented the synthesis of all the lessons she had learned. It was neither the blue of the traditional Jedi, nor the red of the Sith, but something new, something that spoke of possibilities that had never been explored. The weapon was beautiful in its uniqueness, a symbol of hope that transcended the old divisions between light and dark. The fleet's departure from Ajan Kloss was a moment of profound significance, marking the beginning of the end for the sequel trilogy's central conflict. The ships that lifted off from the jungle world carried with them the hopes and dreams of countless beings who had never asked for war but had been forced to fight for their freedom. The sight of so many vessels moving in concert, their lights creating a constellation of determination against the darkness of space, was enough to inspire even the most cynical observer. The journey to Exegol was treacherous, requiring the fleet to navigate through regions of space that had been deliberately hidden from conventional sensors. The path took them through stellar nurseries where new stars were being born, past ancient battlefields where the debris of forgotten conflicts still drifted in the cosmic wind, through nebulae that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent consciousness. The way was marked by the remnants of previous attempts to reach the Sith world, the hulks of ships that had been destroyed by the Emperor's defenses or lost to the navigational hazards that protected his stronghold. The Emperor's preparation for the final battle was as meticulous as everything else he had planned. The defenses of Exegol were not just military but metaphysical, drawing on the accumulated dark side energy of the planet to create barriers that would challenge both the body and the spirit of any who dared to approach. The Final Order fleet was positioned to take maximum advantage of the planet's natural defenses, their weapons charged and ready to deliver destruction on a scale that would make the Death Star seem like a primitive weapon. The Sith Eternals' rituals had been building to this moment for decades, their ceremonies designed to channel the power of every being who had ever served the dark side. The energy that flowed through the Emperor's throne room was not just his own, but the accumulated malevolence of millennia, the concentrated hatred of every Sith Lord who had ever lived. The power was intoxicating and terrible, offering the promise of absolute dominion over the galaxy. But the Emperor had made a crucial mistake in his calculations. He had assumed that the galaxy's response to his return would be driven by the same fear and desperation that had characterized previous conflicts. He had not anticipated the possibility that beings would choose to fight, not because they were afraid, but because they were hopeful, not because they were desperate, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. The moment when the improvised fleet emerged from hyperspace around Exegol was one of the most dramatic in galactic history. The sight of thousands of civilian vessels, their hulls gleaming in the light of the Sith world's unnatural star, was enough to give even the Emperor pause. This was not the small, desperate force he had expected, but a true popular uprising, a demonstration of the galaxy's unwillingness to submit to tyranny. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict in galactic history. The Final Order's weapons were more powerful than anything the improvised fleet could bring to bear, but they were countered by the sheer determination of beings who had chosen to risk everything for the chance to live free. The civilian ships that had never been designed for combat found ways to contribute to the fight, their crews displaying the kind of ingenuity and courage that had always characterized the galaxy's defenders. The Emperor's realization that his plans had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the galaxy's character was a moment of profound shock. The beings who had answered the call to resist were not motivated by the same selfish desires that had driven the Sith for millennia. They were fighting not for personal gain, but for the simple right to exist as free beings, to make their own choices and determine their own destinies. The final confrontation between Rey and the Emperor was more than just a battle between two individuals. It was a clash between two different visions of what the galaxy could become. The Emperor represented the old way, the belief that power should be concentrated in the hands of those strong enough to seize it. Rey represented something new, the possibility that power could be shared, that strength could be found in cooperation rather than domination. The voices of the Jedi who had come before began to speak to Rey as the battle reached its climax, their words carrying the weight of millennia of accumulated wisdom. They spoke not of victory or defeat, but of balance, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that gave meaning to existence. They reminded her that the Force was not a weapon to be wielded, but a responsibility to be borne, a trust that connected all living beings in a web of mutual dependence. The Emperor's final gambit was to attempt to drain the life force from the dyad between Rey and Kylo Ren, to use their connection as a conduit for the power he needed to sustain his unnatural existence. But the bond between them had evolved beyond his ability to control, had become something that transcended his understanding of the Force. The love that had developed between them, the mutual respect and understanding that had grown from their shared experiences, proved to be more powerful than the hatred that had sustained the Sith for millennia. The moment when Rey chose to sacrifice herself to defeat the Emperor was the culmination of her entire journey. The young woman who had grown up believing herself to be nobody, who had spent years waiting for someone else to give her life meaning, had discovered that the greatest power came not from taking but from giving, not from dominating but from serving. Her sacrifice was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter in the galaxy's ongoing struggle between light and darkness. The alliance that had formed to fight the Final Order was more than just a military coalition. It was a demonstration of the galaxy's capacity for cooperation and mutual support. The beings who had risked everything to stand against tyranny had discovered that their differences were less important than their shared commitment to freedom. The victory they achieved was not just military but moral, a proof that the values they fought for were worth the price they had paid. As the Final Order fleet burned in the space around Exegol, as the Emperor's plans crumbled into dust, the galaxy began to understand that it had achieved something unprecedented. The alliance that had defeated the Sith was not based on the dominance of one species or system over others, but on the voluntary cooperation of beings who had chosen to work together for the common good. The victory was not just over the First Order, but over the old ways of thinking that had made such conflicts inevitable. The Final Alliance had proven that the galaxy's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or its technology, but in its diversity, in the countless different perspectives and experiences that its inhabitants brought to the challenges they faced. The sequel trilogy's greatest lesson was that freedom was not something that could be imposed from above, but something that had to be chosen by each individual, something that required the active participation of every being who valued their independence. The galaxy that emerged from the final battle was not perfect, but it was free. The alliance that had defeated the Emperor would face new challenges, would encounter new threats, would be tested by the inevitable conflicts that arose when different beings tried to live together in peace. But they had proven that such challenges could be met, that the galaxy's capacity for cooperation was greater than its tendency toward conflict. The sequel trilogy's conclusion was not an ending, but a beginning. Not the final victory of light over darkness, but the establishment of a new balance that would allow both to coexist. The galaxy had learned that the Force was not a zero-sum game, but a shared resource, that the power it offered was most effective when it was used in service of others rather than in pursuit of personal gain. The space around Exegol had become a graveyard of metal and dreams, where the hulks of destroyed vessels drifted like monuments to the galaxy's desperate gamble. The Final Order fleet, massive and terrible in its dark perfection, hung in the planet's artificial atmosphere like a swarm of mechanical predators, their weapons charged and ready to deliver death on a scale that would make the destruction of Alderaan seem like a gentle mercy. But arrayed against them was something the Emperor had not anticipated, something that challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of power and resistance. The civilian fleet that had answered the Resistance's call stretched across the star system like a constellation of hope, their mismatched hulls gleaming in the unnatural light of Exegol's crimson sun. These were not warships, but the tools of ordinary life transformed into instruments of defiance. Cargo haulers that had carried grain between peaceful worlds now bristled with whatever weapons their crews could improvise. Passenger liners that had once ferried families on vacation now served as mobile command centers for beings who had never fired a shot in anger. The sight of this improvised armada, this collection of vessels that represented every corner of the galaxy's diverse civilizations, was enough to give even the most hardened veterans pause. Admiral Pride stood on the bridge of the Steadfast, his weathered face reflecting the cold light of tactical displays that showed the scope of the resistance they faced. The old Imperial officer had served under the Emperor during the height of the Empire's power, had witnessed the Death Star's construction and the Republic's fall. But the fleet that surrounded them now was unlike anything he had encountered in decades of warfare. These were not professional soldiers following orders, but ordinary beings who had chosen to risk everything for the chance to live free. The Emperor's throne room on Exegol pulsed with dark side energy that had been accumulating for millennia, the very air thick with malevolent power that seemed to have achieved a kind of consciousness. The Sith Eternal, their hooded forms arranged in perfect circles around the central dais, chanted in languages that predated the Republic, their voices creating harmonies that resonated through the Force itself. The sound they produced was not quite music, but something deeper, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. Retzi's approach to the throne room was a journey through corridors that existed as much in the Force as in physical space. The walls were carved with symbols that told the story of the Sith's rise and fall, their victories and defeats, their eternal struggle against the light. Each step she took brought her closer to the source of the galaxy's suffering, to the being who had orchestrated centuries of conflict and pain. But she also felt the presence of those who had come before, the Jedi who had faced similar trials and found the strength to persevere. The lightsaber that hung at her side was more than just a weapon. It was a connection to every being who had ever chosen to stand against the darkness. The yellow blade that it would produce was a color that had not been seen in the galaxy for generations, a hue that represented the synthesis of all the lessons she had learned. It was neither the blue of the traditional Jedi nor the red of the Sith, but something new, something that spoke of possibilities that had never been explored. Kylo Ren's arrival on Exegol had been driven by motivations that he himself did not fully understand. The revelation that he had been manipulated throughout his entire life, that his fall to the dark side had been orchestrated by the Emperor from the beginning, had shattered the carefully constructed identity he had built around his service to the First Order. The man who had once been Ben Solo was beginning to emerge from the shadow of Kylo Ren, and with that emergence came a clarity of purpose that had been absent from his life for years. The confrontation between Rey and the Emperor was not just a battle between two individuals, but a clash between two different visions of what the galaxy could become. The Emperor represented the old way, the belief that power should be concentrated in the hands of those strong enough to seize it. Rey represented something new, the possibility that power could be shared, that strength could be found in cooperation rather than domination. The Emperor's physical appearance was a horror that defied description, his body a nightmare of decay and artificial preservation. The lightning that danced around his fingers was not just electricity, but pure hatred made manifest. The accumulated rage of millennia given physical form. His eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, while his voice carried the weight of authority that had been built on the suffering of countless beings. The revelation that the Emperor had been using the Force dyad between Rey and Kylo Ren to sustain his own existence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his survival. The connection between them, which they had believed to be a natural phenomenon, had been artificially created and maintained to serve the Emperor's needs. Their love, their understanding, their shared experiences, all of it had been perverted into a source of power for the galaxy's greatest monster. But the Emperor had made a crucial miscalculation. The bond between Rey and Kylo Ren had evolved beyond his ability to control, had become something that transcended his understanding of the Force. The love that had developed between them, the mutual respect and understanding that had grown from their shared experiences, proved to be more powerful than the hatred that had sustained the Sith for millennia. The battle that erupted in the throne room was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. On the physical plane, lightsabers clashed with the sound of thunder, their energy blades creating patterns of light that illuminated the chamber's ancient walls. But the true conflict was spiritual, a struggle between different interpretations of the Force and its purpose. The Emperor drew his power from the accumulated suffering of the galaxy, while Rey channeled the strength of every being who had ever chosen to stand against tyranny. The voices of the Jedi who had come before began to speak to Rey as the battle reached its climax, their words carrying the weight of millennia of accumulated wisdom. She heard Obi-Wan Kenobi's calm counsel, felt Yoda's gentle guidance, sensed the presence of Mace Windu and Qui-Gon Jinn, and countless others who had given their lives in service of the light. They spoke not of victory or defeat, but of balance, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that gave meaning to existence. The Emperor's assault was relentless, his lightning striking Rey with the power of a living star. The energy that flowed from his fingertips was not just electrical but spiritual, designed to corrupt as well as destroy. Each bolt carried with it the accumulated hatred of millennia, the concentrated malevolence of every Sith Lord who had ever lived. The pain was beyond description, beyond endurance, beyond anything that a mortal being should be able to survive. But Rey did not face the Emperor alone. The connection that bound her to Kylo Ren allowed her to draw on his strength even as he fought his own battles elsewhere in the Citadel. The former Ben Solo had found his way back to the light, had rejected the darkness that had consumed him for so long. His presence in the Force was like a beacon of hope, a reminder that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. The moment when Rey chose to sacrifice herself to defeat the Emperor was the culmination of her entire journey. The young woman who had grown up believing herself to be nobody, who had spent years waiting for someone else to give her life meaning, had discovered that the greatest power came not from taking but from giving, not from dominating but from serving. Her sacrifice was not the end of her story, but the transformation of it, the moment when she became something greater than she had ever imagined possible. The Force lightning that the Emperor unleashed in his final gambit was more powerful than anything he had ever produced, a storm of dark side energy that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The power was drawn not just from his own reserves, but from the accumulated suffering of every being who had ever served the dark side, every soul who had been corrupted by the promise of easy power. The lightning filled the throne room with a light that was somehow darker than darkness, a radiance that seemed to absorb hope itself. But Rey stood against it, her lightsaber blazing with the combined strength of every Jedi who had ever lived. The yellow blade that ignited from her weapon was not just light but hope made manifest, the accumulated courage of millennia given physical form. She became a conduit for the Force itself, a channel through which the galaxy's accumulated wisdom and compassion could flow. The Emperor's realization that his plans had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Force was a moment of profound shock. He had assumed that power was finite, that gaining it required taking it from others. But Rey's sacrifice demonstrated that the Force was not a zero-sum game, but a shared resource that grew stronger when it was used in service of others rather than in pursuit of personal gain. The death of the Emperor was not just the end of an individual, but the collapse of a philosophy that had poisoned the galaxy for millennia. The dark side energy that had accumulated on Exegol began to dissipate, released from the artificial constraints that had held it in place. The Sith Eternal, their purpose fulfilled and their master destroyed, crumbled to dust as the power that had sustained them fled back to its source. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Rey's sacrifice to defeat the Emperor had drained her life force completely, leaving her body still and silent on the throne room floor. The young woman who had brought hope to the galaxy, who had shown that even the darkest heritage could be overcome through choice and courage, had given everything to ensure that others could live free. Kylo Ren's arrival in the throne room came too late to help in the battle, but not too late to witness its aftermath. The man who had once been Ben Solo looked down at Rey's still form and understood that the galaxy had lost something precious, something that could never be replaced. But he also understood that her sacrifice had meaning, that her death had purchased freedom for countless beings who would never know her name. The decision to give his own life to save Rey was not born of desperation, but of love, of the understanding that some things were worth any price. The Force dyad that had connected them throughout their journey allowed him to share his life force with her, to bring her back from the edge of death at the cost of his own existence. The act was both redemption and sacrifice, the final proof that Ben Solo had found his way back to the light. The moment when Rey's eyes opened, when she drew her first breath in what should have been her final rest, was a miracle that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death. But the joy of her resurrection was tempered by the knowledge that it had come at the cost of Ben Solo's life, that the man who had helped her find her way had given everything to ensure that she could continue the journey. The kiss they shared was brief but profound, a moment of connection that transcended the physical and touched the very essence of what it meant to be alive. It was a recognition of the love that had developed between them, despite all the obstacles, all the pain, all the reasons why it should have been impossible. And then Ben Solo faded into the Force, his body becoming one with the energy that connected all living things. The destruction of the Final Order fleet was swift and complete, their massive vessels succumbing to the same malevolent energy that had once protected them. Without the Emperor's will to guide them, without the dark side power that had sustained their technology, the ships became nothing more than metal and machinery, their crews awakening from the conditioning that had made them into perfect servants of tyranny. The celebration that erupted throughout the galaxy was unlike anything that had been seen since the Empire's fall. From the core worlds to the Outer Rim, from the richest systems to the poorest frontier worlds, beings who had lived in fear of the First Order's rise took to the streets in spontaneous demonstrations of joy. The Emperor's death had been felt through the Force by every sensitive being in the galaxy, a moment of release that marked the end of an era. But the victory was not without its shadows. The galaxy that emerged from the final battle was scarred by decades of conflict, its institutions weakened by years of war and oppression. The task of rebuilding would be enormous, requiring the same kind of cooperation and sacrifice that had made victory possible. The alliance that had defeated the Emperor would face new challenges, would encounter new threats, would be tested by the inevitable conflicts that arose when different beings tried to live together in peace. Race's survival was a gift to the galaxy, a reminder that hope could endure even in the darkest moments. The young woman who had begun her journey as a scavenger on a desert world had become something unprecedented. A Jedi who carried within her the wisdom of both light and dark, who understood that the Force was not about choosing sides but about finding balance. The lightsaber that she had constructed for the final battle would become a symbol of the new order that emerged from the Empire's ashes. Its yellow blade spoke of possibilities that had never been explored, of paths that had never been taken, of a future where the old divisions between Jedi and Sith might finally be transcended. The weapon was beautiful in its uniqueness, a physical manifestation of the hope that had sustained the galaxy through its darkest hours. The Emperor's defeat marked the end of the sequel trilogy's central conflict, but it also marked the beginning of something new. The galaxy had learned that freedom was not something that could be imposed from above, but something that had to be chosen by each individual, something that required the active participation of every being who valued their independence. The victory over the Final Order was not just military but moral, a proof that the values they fought for were worth the price they had paid. The Force itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the dark side energy that had poisoned Exegol for millennia was finally released. The planet began to crumble, its artificial structures collapsing as the power that had sustained them fled back to its source. The Sith Citadel, that monument to evil that had stood for generations, became nothing more than dust and memory. The spirits of the Jedi who had aided Rey in her final battle began to fade back into the Force, their purpose fulfilled and their peace earned. But their presence would be remembered, their wisdom preserved in the traditions that would guide the galaxy's future. The light that they had kindled would burn eternal, a beacon of hope for all who chose to follow the path of service and sacrifice. The sequel trilogy's conclusion was not an ending but a transformation, not the final victory of light over darkness, but the establishment of a new balance that would allow both to coexist. The galaxy had learned that the Force was not a weapon to be wielded, but a responsibility to be shared, that the power it offered was most effective when it was used in service of others, rather than in pursuit of personal gain. The Final Confrontation had proven that love was stronger than hatred, that hope was more powerful than despair, that the courage to sacrifice for others was the ultimate expression of the Force's will. The galaxy would face new challenges, would encounter new threats, would be tested by the inevitable conflicts that arose when different beings tried to live together in peace. But they had proven that such challenges could be met, that the galaxy's capacity for cooperation was greater than its tendency toward conflict. The Emperor was dead, the Final Order was destroyed, and the galaxy was free. But freedom, as the survivors understood, was not a destination but a journey, not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be earned anew with each generation. The sequel trilogy's greatest lesson was that the eternal struggle between light and darkness was not something to be won, but something to be balanced, not a war to be ended, but a dance to be continued for all eternity. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of the Final Order was wounded but not broken, scarred by decades of conflict, but somehow stronger for having survived the trial. In the days following the Battle of Exegol, as news of the Emperor's defeat spread through the hyperspace communication networks, worlds that had lived in fear began to remember what freedom felt like. The celebrations that erupted across 1,000 systems were not just expressions of joy, but declarations of independence, statements that the galaxy's diverse civilizations would never again submit to the kind of tyranny that had nearly consumed them. On Coruscant, the former imperial capital that had been transformed into the seat of the new republic before its government's flight to the Hosnian system, crowds gathered in the streets with a spontaneity that surprised even the most optimistic observers. The planet's massive city sprawl, its endless levels of towering spires and shadowed depths, had been largely silent during the First Order's rise. The inhabitants had learned to keep their heads down, to avoid attracting attention, to survive by becoming invisible. But now they emerged from their hiding places with the cautious hope of beings who had almost forgotten what it meant to speak freely. The statues of Emperor Palpatine that had been erected throughout the city during the First Order's brief occupation were torn down by citizens who had never dared to dream of such defiance. The monuments to tyranny, crafted from the finest materials and designed to inspire awe and submission, were reduced to rubble by the hands of ordinary beings who had found extraordinary courage. The destruction was not driven by rage, but by a quiet determination to ensure that the symbols of oppression would never again cast their shadows over the galaxy's heart. On Naboo, the Emperor's homeworld, the celebrations were more subdued, but no less meaningful. The planet that had given birth to the galaxy's greatest monster had also produced some of its greatest heroes, and the inhabitants understood better than most the complex relationship between good and evil, between choice and destiny. The memorial services held in the Ted's Great Plaza honored not just the victims of the Emperor's reign, but the possibility of redemption that existed within every being, no matter how far they had fallen. The resistance base on Ajan Kloss had been transformed from a hidden refuge into a center of galactic coordination, its jungle clearings now filled with ships from across the galaxy. Beings who had fought in the final battle gathered to share their stories, to mourn their losses, to plan for the future that their sacrifice had made possible. The diversity of the group was staggering, representing every species and culture that had answered the call to resist. Yet despite their differences, they shared a common understanding of what they had achieved and what it meant for the galaxy's future. Rey stood among the ancient trees of the jungle world, her yellow lightsaber deactivated but still warm in her hands. The weapon that had helped her defeat the Emperor was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of the new path that the galaxy would need to follow. The young woman who had grown up believing herself to be nobody had discovered that identity was not something inherited, but something chosen. That power came not from bloodline, but from the decisions one made in moments of crisis. The knowledge that she carried the Emperor's blood would always be a part of her story, but she had learned that heritage was not destiny. The dark side energy that flowed through her veins had been transformed into something else through her choices, through her commitment to protecting rather than dominating, through her understanding that true strength came from service rather than power. The revelation that had once threatened to destroy her had become a source of wisdom that would guide her future. The ancient Jedi texts that had survived the destruction of Luke's academy were spread out before her, their pages filled with wisdom that took on new meaning in the light of recent events. The writing spoke of balance, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, of the need to understand both in order to truly master either. But Rey's interpretation of these teachings was influenced by her own experiences, by the knowledge that she had gained through her connection with Kylo Ren, by her understanding of the Force as something that transcended the traditional divisions between Jedi and Sith. The task of rebuilding the galaxy's institutions would be enormous, requiring the same kind of cooperation and sacrifice that had made victory possible. The New Republic's government had been destroyed along with the Hosnian system, leaving a power vacuum that would need to be filled by beings who understood the importance of freedom and the dangers of centralized authority. The challenge would be to create systems that could provide stability and security without becoming the kind of oppressive regime that they had fought to destroy. Finn's transformation from stormtrooper to hero had been one of the sequel trilogy's most remarkable journeys, but his story was far from over. The former soldier understood better than most what it meant to break free from conditioning, to choose one's own path despite the pressures of authority and tradition. His experience as a stormtrooper had given him insights into the First Order's methods that would prove invaluable in the work of deprogramming the millions of beings who had been enslaved by the regime's ideology. The Stormtrooper rebellion that had begun with Finn's defection had spread throughout the Final Order fleet as conditioning programs failed and individual consciousness reasserted itself. The white-armored soldiers who had once been the instruments of oppression were now refugees in need of rehabilitation, beings who had been robbed of their childhoods and their choices but who retained the capacity for growth and change. The process of helping them rediscover their humanity would be long and difficult, but it was essential to the galaxy's healing. Poe Dameron's leadership during the final battle had proven that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that the willingness to sacrifice for others was not limited to those with mystical powers or noble bloodlines. The young pilot had evolved from a reckless hotshot into a commander who understood that victory was not just about winning battles, but about preserving the values that made victory worth achieving. His example would inspire a new generation of leaders who understood that authority was a responsibility rather than a privilege. The revelation that Leia had been Force-sensitive throughout her life, that she had been receiving training from Luke even as she pursued her political career, added another layer of complexity to the sequel trilogy's exploration of destiny and choice. The legendary princess had chosen to serve the galaxy through politics rather than through the mystical traditions of the Jedi, but her connection to the Force had been no less real or meaningful. Her death had been a sacrifice that made the final victory possible, a demonstration that heroism could take many forms. The lightsaber that Leia had constructed decades earlier but never used in battle was now a relic of the path not taken, a reminder that the Force worked through all beings regardless of their chosen profession or calling. The weapon's elegant design reflected its creator's personality, practical and beautiful in equal measure, designed not for elaborate combat but for the simple purpose of protecting those who could not protect themselves. It would be preserved as a symbol of the different ways that the Force could serve the galaxy. The connection between Rey and the redeemed Ben Solo had been one of the sequel trilogy's most powerful themes, demonstrating that love could overcome even the deepest corruption. The Force dyad that had bound them together had evolved from a tool of manipulation into something genuine and transformative, proof that the bonds between beings could transcend the artificial divisions created by ideology and circumstance. Ben's sacrifice to save Rey had been the ultimate expression of his return to the light, a final act of love that redeemed a lifetime of darkness. The galaxy's reaction to the news of Kylo Ren's redemption and death was complex and varied, reflecting the different ways that beings processed trauma and loss. Some saw in Ben Solo's story a message of hope, proof that even the most fallen could find their way back to the light. Others struggled to forgive the acts of violence and oppression that had been committed in service of the dark side. The debate over his legacy would continue for generations, but his final sacrifice had planted seeds of understanding that would eventually bear fruit. The Force itself seemed to be evolving in response to the events of the sequel trilogy, developing new possibilities and connections that had not existed in previous eras. The traditional divisions between light and dark, between Jedi and Sith, were being challenged by beings who understood that the Force was larger than any single interpretation or philosophy. The yellow lightsaber that Rey had constructed was a symbol of this new understanding, representing a path that honored the wisdom of the past while remaining open to the possibilities of the future. The ancient Jedi temple on Jakku had been restored following the Emperor's defeat, its stones cleaned and its chambers reopened to serve as a center of learning and meditation. But the teachings offered there were different from those of the old Jedi Order, incorporating lessons learned from the failures and successes of the sequel trilogy's events. The new generation of Force users who would study there would learn not just the techniques of lightsaber combat and Force manipulation, but the importance of balance, of understanding both light and darkness, of serving the galaxy rather than ruling it. The Porgs that inhabited the island had become unofficial guardians of the temple, their simple joy in existence serving as a reminder that the Force flowed through all living things, not just those who could manipulate it consciously. The small creatures had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of Jedi Masters, the endless cycle of conflict and peace that characterized galactic history. Their presence was a stabilizing influence, a connection to the natural world that helped prevent the kind of arrogance and isolation that had contributed to the old Jedi Order's downfall. The children across the galaxy who had been born with Force sensitivity were no longer hidden away or suppressed, their abilities recognized as gifts that could serve the common good. The stable boy from Canto Bight who had helped Finn and Rose escape had become a symbol of this new generation, representing the potential that existed in every being, regardless of their circumstances or background. The Force was awakening in ways that had not been seen for generations, creating possibilities that would reshape the galaxy's future. The reconstruction of the galaxy's communication networks had become a priority, enabling the diverse worlds and species to coordinate their efforts and share their knowledge. The isolation that had characterized the First Order's reign was being replaced by a new age of cooperation and exchange, as beings who had been enemies learned to work together for the common good. The diversity that had once been seen as a weakness was now recognized as the galaxy's greatest strength. The museums and libraries that had been destroyed during the various conflicts were being rebuilt with a new understanding of their importance. The preservation of knowledge, of history, of the stories that connected beings across time and space was recognized as essential to preventing the kind of manipulation and deception that had enabled the Emperor's rise. The new institutions would be more inclusive, more representative of the galaxy's diversity, more committed to truth than to any particular ideology. The trade routes that had been disrupted by decades of warfare were being re-established, bringing prosperity to worlds that had been isolated by conflict. The economic recovery was not just about wealth, but about the connections between different cultures and species, the understanding that came from peaceful exchange, the recognition that cooperation was more profitable than conquest. The galaxy was learning to see itself as a single, interconnected community rather than a collection of competing factions. The art and music that emerged from the post-imperial period reflected the complex emotions of a galaxy that had survived its darkest hour. The compositions were neither purely celebratory nor entirely mournful, but something more complex, acknowledging both the joy of freedom and the pain of loss. The cultural renaissance that followed the Emperor's defeat was characterized by a new willingness to explore difficult themes, to confront uncomfortable truths, to find beauty in the midst of tragedy. The military forces that had fought in the final battle were being transformed into peacekeeping organizations, their focus shifting from conquest to protection, from destruction to construction. The veterans of the conflict understood better than most the true cost of war, the price that was paid by ordinary beings when diplomacy failed and violence became necessary. Their commitment to preventing future conflicts was absolute, their dedication to the cause of peace unshakable. The Force ghost of Luke Skywalker appeared to Rey during her meditation sessions, his presence a reminder that death was not the end, but a transformation, that the wisdom of the past could guide the choices of the present. The legendary Jedi Master had found peace in the Force, his failures and successes integrated into an understanding that transcended the limitations of mortal existence. His teachings were no longer about the rigid adherence to tradition, but about the importance of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. The galaxy that emerged from the sequel trilogy was not perfect, but it was free. The challenges that lay ahead would be enormous. The temptations toward tyranny and oppression would be constant. The need for vigilance would be eternal. But the beings who had fought for freedom understood that the price of liberty was ongoing responsibility, that the work of building a just society was never finished, that each generation would need to choose anew between the easy path of submission and the difficult path of freedom. The legacy of the sequel trilogy was not just in the battles that had been won or the enemies that had been defeated, but in the understanding that had been achieved. The galaxy had learned that the Force was not a weapon to be wielded, but a responsibility to be shared, that power was most effective when it was used in service of others rather than in pursuit of personal gain, that the eternal struggle between light and darkness was not something to be won, but something to be balanced. The new beginnings that emerged from the ashes of the old order were characterized by hope rather than fear, by cooperation rather than domination, by the understanding that the galaxy's diversity was its greatest strength. The sequel trilogy's greatest achievement was not the defeat of any particular enemy, but the demonstration that ordinary beings could achieve extraordinary things when they chose to work together for the common good. The stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of heroes, the endless cycle of conflict and peace that characterized galactic history, now looked down on a galaxy that was learning to see itself as a single, interconnected community. The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but it was a future that the galaxy would choose for itself, free from the manipulation and control that had characterized the dark times. The sequel trilogy's conclusion was not an ending, but a transformation, not the final victory of light over darkness, but the establishment of a new balance that would allow both to coexist. The galaxy had learned that the Force was not about choosing sides, but about finding harmony, that the power it offered was most effective when it was used in service of life rather than in pursuit of death, that the eternal struggle between opposing forces was what gave existence meaning and purpose. The twin suns of Tatooine hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless dunes where the saga of the Skywalker family had begun so many years ago. The desert world that had once seemed like the edge of nowhere had become, in the fullness of time, the center of everything that mattered. Here, where a young farm boy had first dreamed of adventure among the stars, where the call to heroism had first stirred in an innocent heart, the greatest story ever told was finally finding its rest. Resi stood at the edge of the Lars homestead, her weathered robes fluttering in the gentle desert breeze that carried with it the scent of moisture and the promise of cooler air. The journey that had brought her here had been long and difficult, filled with discoveries that had challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the galaxy. But now, as she looked out over the landscape that had shaped so many destinies, she felt a peace that had eluded her for most of her life. The lightsabers she carried were more than just weapons. They were connections to a legacy that stretched back through generations of heroes and villains, of choices made and prices paid, of love discovered and sacrifice embraced. Luke's lightsaber, the weapon that had once belonged to his father, had been the instrument of redemption and the tool of justice. Leia's lightsaber, elegant and purposeful, represented the path not taken, the reminder that heroism could manifest in countless different forms. The decision to bury the lightsabers here, in the sand that had witnessed the beginning of the Skywalker story, was not made lightly. These weapons had served their purpose, had played their part in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, had helped to restore balance to a galaxy that had teetered on the edge of eternal night. But their time was ending, just as the time of the old ways was ending, making room for something new to grow. The twin graves that Rey had prepared were simple but dignified, marked by stones that she had gathered from the desert floor. The lightsabers rested in the sand like sleeping guardians, their purpose fulfilled, their legacy secure. The weapons that had once blazed with the light of justice now lay silent, their energy returned to the force that had created them, their stories complete. The yellow lightsaber that Rey had constructed for her own journey remained at her side, its unique blade a symbol of the new path that the galaxy would need to follow. The weapon was beautiful in its simplicity, its design reflecting the synthesis of everything she had learned about the Force and her place within it. The yellow blade spoke of possibilities that had never been explored, of wisdom that came from understanding rather than dogma, of a future where the ancient divisions between light and dark might finally be transcended. The moisture farm that had been home to the Lars family for generations stood empty now, its buildings weathered by decades of desert winds and the passage of time. But the structures remained solid, their foundations deep, their walls strong enough to withstand the storms that periodically swept across the desert. The farm was a monument to the quiet heroism of ordinary people, to the understanding that not all victories were won with lightsabers, that sometimes the greatest courage was found in the simple decision to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The Force flowed through this place with a gentleness that Rey had rarely experienced, carrying with it the echoes of all the lives that had been touched by the Skywalker legacy. She could feel Luke's presence in the workshop where he had once dreamed of adventure, could sense Anakin's spirit in the very stones of the buildings his stepbrother had maintained. The ghosts of the past were not haunting this place but blessing it, their peace finally complete. The binary sunset that painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson was a sight that had inspired dreams and witnessed farewells, that had marked beginnings and endings, that had served as a constant reminder of the beauty that could be found even in the harshest environments. The twin suns had watched over the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of heroes, the endless cycle of conflict and peace that characterized galactic history. As Rey watched the sun sink toward the horizon, she felt the presence of all those who had come before, all those who had made the choices that had led to this moment of peace. The voices of the Jedi whispered in the desert wind, not with instructions or demands, but with simple acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The long night was ending, and a new day was beginning. The galaxy that stretched out beyond this desert world was free to choose its own path. Free to learn from the mistakes of the past, free to build a future based on cooperation rather than domination. The sequel trilogy's greatest victory was not the defeat of any particular enemy, but the demonstration that ordinary beings could achieve extraordinary things when they chose to work together for the common good. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each one a sun that might nurture worlds where freedom could flourish, where the Force could flow in balance, where the eternal struggle between light and darkness could continue in harmony rather than conflict. The saga was complete, but the story would never end, written anew by each generation that chose to reach for the light. In the gentle silence of the desert night, Rey Skywalker walked away from the graves of the past and toward the promise of tomorrow, carrying with her the wisdom of ages and the hope of all those yet to come. The twin suns had set, but they would rise again, and with them, the endless possibility of what the galaxy could become. The sequel trilogy's final lesson drifted on the desert wind like a prayer that hope was stronger than fear, that love was more powerful than hatred, that the light would always find a way to shine through the darkness. The saga was ending, but the Force would be with them, always.